Lisa, can you, we do. We have audio. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Jolina Grande, and I am privileged to serve as the chair of the California Workforce Pathways Joint Advisory Committee, and I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Today's meeting is being broadcast, so all interested parties can view the broadcast by visiting the CDE website at http://cde.videossc.com. The link can also be found on the committee's webpage. And as I'm looking around, I believe we have a quorum, so we can continue. It appears as though we have 5 members in attendance. So it is 11:03, and this meeting is officially called to order. All right, let's start with our first item of business. We need to approve the meeting minutes from the February 19th, 2019 meeting. Has everyone had a chance to review the minutes, and is there a motion to approve the meeting minutes from February 19th?
So moved.
Thank you. Member Acosta, is there a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, Member Sun. Vice Chair Sun. Are there any comments, corrections, edits that need to be made to the minutes from the February 19th meeting? Seeing none, are there any comments from the public? I don't see anyone approaching the microphone. So therefore, I think we're ready to move to a vote. The Bagley-Keene Open Meeting Act requires that we vote by roll call. So our California Department of Education staff will now take the roll.
Aye.
Chair Grande.
Aye.
Member Ortiz-Licon. Member Fawn. Vice Chair Sun.
Aye.
The minutes from February 19th, 2019 have been approved. As a reminder, all of our meeting minutes and the recordings of the broadcast are available on the California Workforce Pathways Joint Advisory Committee's webpage. Today's agenda includes a review of the proposed changes to the guiding policy principles to support K-14 plus pathways, and I want to thank Lisa and staff for putting together a track change document that helps us isolate where the edits have been made, and also to discuss the state Strengthening Career and Technical Education for the 21st Century Act Perkins 5 revised draft transition plan. And I would really like to thank everyone who put in all of the effort to create this second version of the draft plan. It reads so much more fluidly than the first draft that we saw at the last meeting. So to get started, is Patricia DeCoste, Deputy Executive Director from the State Board of Education, going to address and review for us a brief purpose of the committee?
Yes.
Good morning.
Good morning, Chair Grande, Vice Chair Sun, and members. Just briefly, you know, I've kind of covered this in the past. I think when we first started our meetings, there was a need to kind of cover the purpose of the joint committee meetings. I think it probably still serves to, you know, we don't see you every day, so you know, just to kind of review a little bit about what it is that we're undertaking here with this committee. So there are a few purposes for the committee. In statute, it delineates that the committee is charged with developing a state plan for Perkins for submission to the federal government. And so we are undertaking the transition plan at this particular time, and we're hoping that we can schedule a meeting in April to, you know, continue our discussions after today. So that is something that we will be discussing with you later today. And then later in May, starting in May, we really want to start pivoting and focusing on actual development of the state plan for submission in, I think it's to be submitted in April of 2020. So we don't have a whole lot of time. We're going to need to build in a lot of stakeholder engagement, you know, regional meetings, and so we'll need to start planning how we're going to approach all of that. And then, of course, as of the Budget Act of 2018 built in, another purpose for the joint committee, and that is to review the outcome metrics for both the CTE incentive grant program, as well the ongoing funds, as well as the K-12 component of the Strong Workforce Program. So that will be something that we will begin bringing before you when we start meeting later this year, as we approximate the timeline for submission or for getting your approval by November 30th. And I think this will be, this is going to take a lot of effort as well. I mean, not so much as last year, but I think it'll be important for us to take a little time to review what we submitted for this year, again next year. So with that, if you have any comments.
Can I just thank you very much for helping everyone orient themselves each time at the beginning of our meeting. It's not only beneficial for us as members of the committee, but also for anyone that might be watching the broadcast. Thank you so much.
Welcome.
And I now see before me Lisa Reimers, who's going to briefly review our materials for this meeting and launch us on our pathway to get through by 4 o'clock today. Oh, before we get started, Member Costa has a process question.
I'm just curious because obviously we were kind of talking about reviewing the document late last night, and then there's a track change document this morning in our packet, which would have been frankly quite helpful when we were reviewing the document. And I'm just curious why we weren't able to get a version that tracked the changes in the document.
Due to restrictions on posting documents online, we can't do draft track change stuff when we're posting on our website. And so that is why it was not posted for 508 accessibility and other items.
Yeah. Hello, is this on? Just Tom Adams, Deputy Superintendent. One of the challenges in posting of documents is 508 compliance in terms of accessibility, and the challenge is that much more when we have a track changes version of it. So while the content is the same, it's easier for us to put an accessible version of one without track changes than one with. It is on. We did. Hello? Okay, now it's on. Yeah, okay. It's working. And so am I, so. So one of the challenges in becoming 508 compliant is actually making sure the documents are accessible. And once you put it into a track changes format, it becomes that much more complicated for CDE staff. So we worked first on making sure that you got a version, and then doing the track changes, like you said, is obviously far easier for us, but we could not get that done in time for 508 compliance, and so that's why it's in your folder.
Thank you. All right, Lisa, the floor is yours. What do we have today?
Okay. So first we have our agendas, and then you'll see that we go into the minutes that you all just approved. The yellow will be our existing principles document, the one that was approved last year. All the green items and your track changes are for item 1, which will be the proposed changes that we received from Member Costa at the last meeting. And then in the goldenrod, you have the agenda item. You have 2 plans that look very similar. The one with the Department of Education seal is the official document that we worked from with the guidance from the feds. It doesn't have any of our state information in it. It's just the document that we received. And then on the other document, you'll see it says draft on top. This is that document put into this document with our responses that Russ and that team will lead you through most of the day. And I think that's all the items. Any questions?
It makes it seem illusory that there's only 2 agenda items and 5 hours dedicated, and let's hope we can be done by 4 today. All right. Thank you very much. Okay, so we're ready for item number 1. This is an information and action item that will begin with an update to the guiding policy principles to support K-14 plus pathways as approved by the California Workforce Pathways Joint Advisory Committee in 2018, as well as the recommendation that we review and approve the proposed changes. So if everyone would like to take out their track change document, Lisa, are you ready to lead us through it?
I'm ready.
Very good. Let's get started.
All right, well, good morning again, members. So here we go with another iteration of our principles. The way I designed this presentation, I'll go into that a little bit later. So we did the public feedback in August through November. We had 45 responses. At the January meeting, I presented to you and you requested to see every single response because I just gave you a summary. So in February, I came back, gave you all the responses. You guys debated a little bit, decided that you didn't want to make any major changes to the principles until you saw them in action. But one thing that you did want to see is more student-centered language that Ms. Member Costa provided to us. So the way I
I'm
organize.
sorry, Lisa, just the screen in front of us is not on. I think it's on the TVs, but I think we just need to turn it on, it's showing red.
There we go. Is it showing?
No, not yet.
Right.
It is times like this that I really appreciate having copies of your PowerPoint slideshow. So when our technology isn't cooperating, we have the opportunity to view the handout.
Would you like me to continue on or give them a minute?
It's turned on. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, we are on daylight savings time, so maybe the monitor has decided that, yeah, it's not quite ready yet.
I can say that there is not a PowerPoint for item 2. So it's only for this one.
Okay.
No, because it's showing on other screens. It's the TV there.
Well, you at least want to get started on the background, and then maybe we can get into the other items once the PowerPoint begins to display.
Absolutely. So as I was saying at the February meeting, you asked for us to include student-centered language, which Member Costa provided for us. So I'm going to move to slide number 3. So the way I designed this presentation is, especially for the audience, you would take the attachment for this presentation, and I have every change noted by line. So on your handout, you'll see that we line numbered everything like a legal document. So I'm using that as my point of reference back and forth. We did do one overall change throughout the whole document. The acronym was CWPJAC. We added the C in front of it because it is the California Workforce Pathways. So you'll see the C's pop up all the way throughout the whole document. So we're going to move on to the next slide. Line 6 in the title, to add student-centered. So the new title would be Guiding Policy Principles to Support Student-Centered K through 14 plus Pathways. Moving on to the preamble, there was really only 3 changes on the preamble. One is to start with the new sentence, which would be the guiding policy principles to support student-centered K-14 plus pathways are focused on all students and ensuring the best possible opportunities for students. Line 14, we would add for all students before our list of goals. And lines 23 to 22, we would, after the sentence that ends in complementary whole, we would add the sentence, students benefit most by having seamless cross-system collaboration. So those would be the changes for the preamble. Moving on to the guiding policy principles section.
Can
Yes,
we
ma'am.
stop on that
Yes,
one
we
and
can.
entertain comments on the preamble before moving forward? It gives us just a little bit more time for our technology to catch up with us for those who want to make comments. Vice Chair Sun.
Thank you. So just a comment that the first sentence that was added to the preamble, the centered and student-centered should probably be capitalized.
Okay.
And we should figure out whether if we want student-centered hyphenated or not hyphenated, because it is hyphenated under the guiding policy principles, a little bit down, a focus on student-centered delivery of services. I think that was prior language.
Yes, that was prior language.
Yeah, so we're just consistency.
Yep.
Okay, one way or the other. I don't think it really matters to either one, okay. And then just a general comment overall, a lot of these are just very small technical changes. However, we, just like the name of this body, it is very long to say the guiding principles to support student-centered K-14 pathways. And I think we will be in documents moving forward, want to reference the guiding principles quite a bit. So we either would nickname it guiding principles, or maybe the workforce pathways guiding principles, something along those lines. So it's the WP, GP or something. So again, I don't have a specific suggestion, but I think we will be referencing it, and the sooner we are able to come up with either an acronym or a nickname for them, then we can get it into our documents, even the transition plan that we will be going to be talking about as well.
Board Member Fawn.
Yes, I think that's a very good suggestion, calling guiding policy or guiding principle would suffice for me rather than a bunch of letters. Yeah. I like the changes so far, Lisa, but perhaps I like to be educated on, and I like the insertion of for all students in line 14 there. Perhaps this is a time where you can educate me a little bit in that. Is the charge of this committee only on the workforce or CTE? If we're doing this for all students, does that include, let's say, a student from high school getting into the community college so that he or she can actually transfer to graduate with a BA degree in English or journalism or chemistry? Would that student be under the auspices of this committee as well, per our preamble here?
I'm going to defer that question to Tom or Patricia.
Maybe we could go to the source. Amy, you suggested it.
My only point was throughout the principles, accessibility is one of the things that's really highlighted in the document. And so I just thought that that was missing actually in the beginning of the document. And so that's why I layered that in, because I felt like it previewed what was going to come later in kind of the principles and kind of throughout the document.
Yes. So Patricia DeCoste, State Board of Education Office. Dr. Fan, we had extensive conversations about this document and the preamble and many parts of this, leading to its approval last year in March, at the March and May Joint Advisory Committee meetings. And there were many conversations that discussed that we wanted to keep this as broad and as open as possible. So sort of the vision around this was, and it you know, so our conversation a little bit later when we start talking about the transition plan is around Perkins, and it is slightly different and more narrow in some ways. But the way that the committee and you know, board members Sun and Ortiz-Licon and Rucker can also weigh in as they were here, but it was to allow as many opportunities and flexibilities to students. So students going from high school into community college, and then, you know, the transfer idea into a four-year institution, students that were seeking to go into community college and getting a certificate or a credential of sorts. So it was to leave it open, and that's one of the reasons why we named it K-14 plus, because it was to signal that it wasn't viewing the community college if there was a completion there or some credential or certificate awarded at that level, that it would be sort of a capstone at that point, but that it was going to leave it open for multiple pathways. So I hope that helps.
Thank you very much. Vice Chair Sun?
And I just wanted to add to, when we looked at the history of this body coming together, it was under a different name, I believe, with the Community College Board of Governors and the state board members coming together, was very narrow and specific to the Perkins plan. And our understanding of how it worked in the past is that you got together and basically looked at what we would do with the funding, and then the two organizations would kind of go back and do their own thing. So what we had hoped in developing the principles way ahead of the Perkins reauthorization was to collaboratively build a vision of how we see ourselves moving forward. And having heard from a lot of stakeholders and folks in this area of workforce pathways and CTE programs, there was an overall lacking of cohesion and coherence. And we had hoped that with the principles that we could somehow, this body, even though we're just K-14, can set a tone and some ways of working together that could influence other organizations as well, beyond us.
I appreciate that explanation very much. So what I'm hearing then is, yes, it's beyond the community college, which is represented by the plus sign after the 14th, but then it is also encompassing of all fields, of all majors, of all disciplines. Is that correct?
I believe that's a question. Is there someone available to answer the question?
I'm okay if it covers all of it.
Yeah, no, I don't think that we were thinking of it to narrow this in any way.
Are there any other comments on the proposed changes to the preamble? Yes, Member Rucker.
Okay, so first of all, with Dr. Fine, I just wanted to respond because I was also been on this committee for quite a while. In looking at, we spent a great deal of time trying to understand not just the charge of the committee, but there are some mega terms in the name of this committee that we took a little bit of time to explore and understand. One of them was the term workforce. And in understanding what the workforce is in California, the conversation, as Board Member Sun has pointed out, the conversation about workforce and workforce development and support has shifted since the last time this particular body is in place. And so then in looking at the workforce, we're not just talking about student matriculation and a conversation that begins with high school and the decisions that students make upon graduation from high school to either continue on to college, whether it's the community college or a four-year institution, or to enter the workforce. What we recognize is at some point when students complete their education, no matter what that level is, they will enter the workforce. So we very broadly saw all preparation as workforce preparation. Our charge, however, focused more narrowly on the students who are covered by the title K-14, and that's the reason why we understand that all preparation is workforce preparation is why the plus was added. So while this plan absolutely informs our charge as it relates to what is covered by you as a member of the community college system and community, and us as leaders in the pre-K through 12th grade community, we recognize that what is written in this plan informs what happens to students who matriculate past our system into another part of workforce preparation. So we do believe the plan itself informs what happens with the university and four-year institutions. That's the reason why adding the title student-centered becomes important, so that all students remain our students even when they matriculate from our system and move into something else, whether it's directly into the workforce or into another part of our education system. So I hope that's helpful. And then, and I checked with Member Costa before I wanted to offer this particular amendment, but the very first sentence in the preamble, this is the high school English teacher in me, I just think it more appropriately belongs in the second paragraph than as the opening statement at the beginning of the preamble.
And I told her I was fine with that.
So I just want to confirm that I'm hearing you correctly, Member Rucker, is that you're saying move that first new sentence to the beginning of the second paragraph?
Yes.
I'm not an English teacher, but I love language. But to begin the preamble with several common themes have emerged, I just feel that something is missing there. I mean, if you look at the famous preamble, in order to make a more perfect union or something like that, there's something missing there which I really like to see. I'll probably sleep with it, but I'd like to come up with a sentence that is overarching as the introduction or as the first sentence to preamble, rather than several common themes have emerged, because I think that's kind of too detailed. I don't know what that sentence is yet at this point, though.
I agree with you, but I would let me suggest, as I was also a student of political science, that preamble was written to include people who didn't look like me. So if our goal is to be all inclusive, and they specifically ended that preamble talking about themselves and their posterity, let's make sure that if we want to do something that's inclusive, maybe the sentence should talk about what the shift, or looking at this, one of the statements we have here is a pressure point. What we have been talking about really, though, are the inflection points that are informing the work we're doing. So maybe an opening sentence summarizing what those key inflection points are that have framed the way we've decided to go about this work. That might be a good way to craft a good opening sentence.
Lisa, if I'm correct in my understanding, prior to inserting the red language, we already had several common themes, which was the beginning. Very good. And what's being suggested is that we move line 9 down to line 18 if we're using our line numbers.
Yes.
And the committee, in its wisdom last year, felt fine with starting the preamble of this document with several common themes. Okay. I'm just trying to make sure that I'm following along. Yes, ma'am.
Wisdom. I mean, we had a lot. We were being overwhelmed by a lot of things. So I appreciate the opportunity to look at this and revisit this again. I think we're more focused on the actual principles than we were on bringing, yes, the language. I do like the idea of starting with an affirmation, and maybe starting with an affirmation about what our students deserve. And so starting with our students, the talents, the assets they bring, and then moving to the guiding principles. We could also start with "We the ladies of the committee." turning it around. But I do like
with that too.
Yes, yes, because we're all ladies, right? I mean, we could all identify as men, so we are ladies. But I do like starting with an affirmation. I think the EO roadmap that we have does a really good job of starting with affirmations. So maybe we could try something similar.
Member Ortiz-Lincoln, would you be willing to draft potential language? Oh, okay. I was just wondering if we might be able to give some direction to.
But well, the EO roadmap already has beautiful language that could help inspire. But I'm happy to look at an initial statement. Yes.
My suggestion is staff is so smart that perhaps they can suggest, and we collectively, all 6 of us, could think about this. Crafting a sentence from the dais is not the best time or approach to it, but like I said, I will sleep with it.
If I could provide a suggestion. Is this working now?
Yes.
On that next sentence where it says the goal of the committee, just say the California Workforce Pathways Joint Advisory Committee has the goal to build, and then the rest. So if you just simply use that as your lead sentence.
And then are you suggesting that we might strike lines 11 and 12 then?
Yeah, because you're taking 9 and 10, you're putting it in that second paragraph. That first sentence is just too weak to really start with. And then if you start with what your goal is, then you're getting right to the point.
So, yeah, as much as I think we could continue to do this, I just feel like we need to move on. And I like the suggestion that Tom Adams provided. I would strike 11 and 12 sentence because I don't think we need to say those things. I would add all students to that first sentence that has been added, where at the end, where it's focused on all students and ensuring that possible we actually said focused on students and ensuring best possible opportunities for all students. Just where we put the all just might emphasize that we want to serve all students. Focused on students and ensuring the best possible opportunity for all students.
Right, okay.
And then, yeah, and then start the goal of the CW, whatever, PJAC is to build connected variable, and I think that would be good.
Okay, and we'll
Make
finesse it.
Okay,
Yeah.
that'd be great.
Okay. All right. Any other comments on the preamble? Seeing none. Lisa, where are we going next?
Okay, we're now going to go to the guiding policy principles section. We only had 2 changes in this area, I believe. Yep. So we're going to go to lines 47 and 48. And we're going to add a sentence at the end of that paragraph that says system alignment allows for greater student portability and career advancement. And then if you go down to letter E, line 55, we would again add, after goals and objectives, we would add for student achievement. Are there any questions on the guiding policy principles section?
Seeing none, let's move forward with the essential elements.
The essential elements had a couple more additions. The first 3, the first one starts on line 59. Instead of saying California recognizes the importance of the following essential elements, it's proposed that we would say California recognizes the importance of creating student-focused essential elements of a high-quality career and pathway. Again, with this. And then on going to letter B, we would add the word student in front of equity. Moving down to lines.
Hold on just a second. Member Costa?
Just, there's a typo, I think. Under, I think you're in line 62. It currently reads, student-centered delivery of services for all K-14 plus college and career pathways incorporates the removal, we're missing the word of, institutional or systemic barriers.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Member Costa. All right, so.
And then just to finish this slide, and then I'll take comments on these 3. Lines 83 and 84 under access, we would add a sentence at the end of that paragraph that says, access also includes creating pathways with demonstrable careers for students. Are there any comments on those 3 changes before I change the slide?
Any comments from members of the Joint Advisory Committee? No.
Okay, and then to finish off this section, we'll move to lines 87 and 88. After programs connect, we would say, so all students can reach across systems easily and succeed with their desired outcomes. So adding can reach across systems easily. And then going down to letter F, lines 112 to 113, we would add an intro part to the sentence, and it would be instructional and educational leadership are the hallmarks of student success. And then moving on to California encourages the culture of innovation.
Before leaving that one, the high school English teacher amongst us, board member Rucker, does that make sense as a sentence? Instructional and educational leadership are the hallmarks of student success. California encourages the culture of innovation.
I was hoping you wouldn't ask me that, because no, it doesn't actually make sense to me.
It looks like we're missing the conjunction, right?
Yeah, I can't figure, there's something, there's something, yeah, there is something missing. I can't figure out what it is. It's, yeah, it's not quite right.
So,
Might I suggest you say because?
Or, yes, because or as, usually, yeah, as instructional.
so this is Russ Weichel. I have a
But I don't know what educational leadership or instructional leadership are the hallmarks of student success. I am trying to picture that. And to me, what does that mean?
My only point in this was that student success, ultimately, one of the biggest predictors is the design and the delivery of the curriculum. And, you know, no pride of ownership in how that is put in here, but I felt like that particular thought was missing here. We're talking about entrepreneurship, and ultimately, how that is designed and delivered will be one of the key determinants of the success for the student.
Okay, if that's what you were trying to say, that's not what the sentence says. If that's the case, this is the reason why I was confused, is because this is kind of a mixed metaphor. Instructional leadership is about educator professional efficacy. Educational leadership is about the professional efficacy of school administrators. And so if what you're trying to say is that the decisions that are made to implement instruction and provide appropriate instructional supports, both inside the classroom and outside the classroom, that's not what that statement is actually saying.
Yeah. I like that phrase, but I don't know, I still can't picture it, or it has the meaning that we want to suggest.
It was just taken from the first sentence of the section. I mean, I just mirrored the language that was there.
Okay, skill instruction, okay.
What if we just had last sentence, California encourages the culture of innovation and entrepreneurialism in program instruction and design that leads to student success? And just take the
whole phrase out.
Yeah, the whole phrase out, and then just have that last sentence that leads to student success.
Would that be appropriate, Member Costa? And capture the essence of what you wanted to see?
Concisely. Did you hear that, Lisa? What member?
Kind of.
Oh.
I had a suggestion from Rachel. And that's what I was grabbing. So if you want me to read that out.
Yes, please.
Okay, so what if we kind of swap it a little bit? we start, California encourages the culture of innovation and entrepreneurialism in program instruction and design, and recognizes that instructional and educational leadership are the hallmarks of student success. No?
I guess that's fine, but back to Member Rucker's point, what is instructional and leadership, educational leadership? Educational leadership in my side of the world is that educators exhibiting leadership in their profession or in their avocation. And I don't know, it just muddles things a little bit. I like what Member Sung's suggestion, real short, brief, and to the point.
Well, we have that recorded, so I can go back to the recording and I can fix this, because it seems like I'm going to have to come back to you. So we'll get that fixed.
Did we, I'm not sure staff got the suggestion.
Okay,
Can you repeat it?
so Vice Chair Sun, I think what you're suggesting is that we omit the 112, 113 addition in the red language and add at the end of the statement that was previously there, California encourages the culture of innovation and entrepreneurialism in program instruction and design that leads to student success. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
So we would only then be adding words to line 114 that leads to student success.
Okay, I've got it.
Any other comments on that section?
Well, we have one more on the next page under section H.
Okay.
And that's lines 133 and 134. And we would add the sentence, continuous improvement ensures students can access the best pathways possible. So that's the last one for this section. So are there any questions?
Do we have any comments?
No, I just want to thank whoever is redlining it.
Yeah. Thank you, Member Costa. All right.
Okay, so moving on to the working norms. There was two additions. One was, you also told me to go back to the comments and all those little wordsmithing thingies.
Yes.
This was one of them. To add the word to on line 165 between design, so it's designed to help, not designed help. And then the next line down, it would be adding student-centered after building. So the sentence would be, these working norms are designed to help guide state, regional, and local entities in building student-centered, high-quality K-14 plus college and career pathways.
Are there any comments on those additions? Seeing none, I would like to thank you, Lisa Reimers, Education Programs Consultant from the California Department of Education, for providing the committee with the proposed changes to the guiding policy principles to support K-14 plus pathways. And it seems as though we will see this again at our next meeting.
Most likely, thank you.
And Member Rucker?
And just based on the question that Dr. Fawn asked at the beginning of this conversation, as I look through the glossary, because he asked specifically about what this committee is doing or what the work of this committee is, it might be helpful to consider adding to the glossary 2 additional words, the definition of workforce and what that means, and the definition of pathways, because we took it for granted because we had a very long and detailed conversation to do a deep dive into understanding what our committee's charge is. And so the glossary exists so that people in the public who are reading it would understand some of the mega terms we use, but workforce pathways has become a term that we understood because we have been involved in that conversation and deeply engaged in it. But as a way of inducting new members, it became really apparent when the question was asked, what are we here for? It wasn't an existential question. It really was trying to understand what those 2 terms of art really mean. And it could be that other people who will read this document and see it new for the first time need to see that as well. So not meaning, well, no, I'm gonna take that back. In being intentional and purposeful, since we're going to have a little bit of extra time for you to come back, maybe adding the words workforce and pathways to the glossary might be helpful.
Very good.
I second that suggestion.
There's a second, then we will look at that.
Well, if there's a second, shouldn't we vote? No, I'm teasing. I'm teasing. This was this is an information item. I erroneously read that it was an action item, so clearly an informational item, and we will see it again with a few more revisions next time. Thank you once again. I appreciate it. All right, moving on to our second and final agenda item. It seems so odd to say that. We are going to be taking a look, excuse me. We are going to be taking a look at the 2019-20 transition plan for the Federal Strengthening Career and Technical Education for the 21st Century Act. We'll just call it our Perkins 5 transition plan, which is an information item that Tom Adams, Educational Administrator for the Career Technical Education Leadership Office at the California Department of Education, will provide some background information on the submission timeline for the Perkins transition plan, as well as the full state plan. And I believe that you're going to be joined by Russ Weekle, retired annuitant at the California Department of Education, who's going to provide us with an overview of the content needed for the state's Perkins 5 transition plan and the full state plan. And I think Heather Matson, our senior research associate for the California Comprehensive Center at WestEd, who's going to help us once again facilitate the discussion on our state's Perkins 5 transition plan. So I think, Heather, you're bringing some friends with you as well. Jeff Merzick, Dean of Workforce and Economic Development Division at the California Community College Chancellor's Office, and anyone else who's going to aid in this discussion. So it looks like we're going to have an all-star cast, Tom, Russ, Heather, Jeff. I am looking forward to this conversation because this draft was an incredible improvement from the first one that we read on the February 19th meeting, and I'm looking forward to a walkthrough. So, Tom, thanks.
Thank you. Just to let you, full disclosure, while we work well together, we haven't danced yet together, so there won't be the choreography this afternoon. So, no, in all seriousness, just to reiterate some of the important points made by Patricia De Casa, the state board staff. We have two tasks before us. One is the transition plan, and the transition plan is important for securing our funding for 1920. So really consider this part, securing funding for both agencies so that we can then move on to the Perkins 5 plan. And it's really the Perkins 5 plan that you'll see the greater bulk of the innovations happen. One thing we are going to do today is, as you make comments, please kind of let us know those things that you think are particular to the transition plan, which you have before you, but if an idea comes before you, like something you want to see carried out in more detail about the Perkins 5 plan, please let us know and we can kind of put it towards that. The other thing I want you to be aware of, in writing the Perkins 5 plan, we're a couple months behind with our usual processes. And I say usual in terms of our Perkins 4 plan, which Russ Weickel put together, in that we did extensive outreach on that plan. And by this time, under Perkins 4, we were already had something to take to the field and start working with folks. And in fact, we ended up with about 200 participants in the last plan. We'd like to meet that goal again, if not more so. And I think the other thing you want to keep in mind in all of this is this is an important plan in terms of things. And I think you're right that Russ Weickel has done a very good job in putting it all in one voice, kind of capturing things. I also want to reiterate that we also want to think about this in the greater picture of things of California and all that has happened, and that we have a CTIG program and a strong workforce program going on at the same time. And so think of Perkins as also kind of part of the chorus of the greater post-secondary and post-secondary education. So, and lastly, we do have as you've already seen already, a very valuable assistant this meeting, Rachel Moran, who will be capturing all your comments in addition to what Russ Weichel will be doing. And I said lastly, but really this is lastly. I just want to say that it was great to get the timely contributions from our colleagues over at Community College, the Chancellor's Office, as well as the extensive comments from Patricia DeCosse on this, so that we feel that we're presenting with you something that's pretty coherent at this point, and really it's less a presentation issue and more of a content tweaks, so, or adjustments, I should say. So thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
All right, I thought I was just going to answer a few questions, but Russ Weichel, so it's like pronounced like Michael Weichel. Anyway, what you have before you on this new transition plan is basically a total rewrite from the original version. The one thing I think that's particularly important to comment on before we start is the U.S. office develops a template for the state plan and the transition plan, and if you look at the two, they're actually the same template. What they do is in the transition plan, they say you're required to answer the following questions, and there's certain questions you do not have to address in the transition plan. This transition plan is based on a draft piece of guidance from the U.S. office, and in fact that the final contents of this draft plan or the state plan is not even completed by the U.S. office yet. And what happened as of February 1st, the feds changed the questions you had to respond to. So one big difference between this document and the prior document is in the prior document it answered some questions that we no longer have to respond to, and then it threw in two questions, I think two questions, that we do now have to respond to that we did not in the prior version. So this is based on that new federal guidance, okay? What I did in this document is I gave you the total document as it appears from the federal government, and including all the questions, and if we are not required to respond to that, I put that down to indicate we're not, do not have to respond to that particular question. And so I think if we, I can direct you to page 4 of the document, which starts with the narrative descriptions. I think one real concern of this committee in the last meeting, and understand last meeting was the first meeting I attended to this group because I just started back at CDE to help with this process, but I know there was a large concern from this committee that the vision and the plan for career technical education in California was not fully expressed in this plan. So I draw your attention to really question B. Well, you may not have the B's, the letters there, but under program administration and implementation, first question has to do with the state's vision of education and workforce development, and that we're not required to answer that question within the transition plan. So what I believe is that while I tried to include as much of your vision as possible in this transition plan where I could, I didn't want to be put in a position where I'm actually repeating information that will be included in the state plan later on. So I tried not to do that. So, but just be assured that in the final state plan, your vision and with input from stakeholders will be clear in that full plan. However, it may not appear that way in this transition plan. The other thing I tried to do in my rewriting of this was that at the last meeting, I also heard that there was a concern that some of the plans sounded CDE-ish and some sounded Community College Chancellor's Office-ish, I guess. And I really wanted to rewrite this as it spoke from California's point of view, not individual agencies' point of view. And so I tried to do that as much as I possibly could. There are policies and procedures that each agency has separately and individually, and where it specifically calls for that, I had to call out those specific policies and procedures by agency. But I really tried to approach this from the perspective of California as one voice rather than as two individual agencies applying for a pot of money.
And I really do think that you captured that quite well. As I'm reading through it this time, I don't see the CDE-ish and the Chancellor's Office-ish, and I thank you very, very much.
Great, thank you. So,
hi, Chair Grande, Vice Chair Sun, members of the committee. I'm Heather Madsen from the California Comprehensive Center. I'll be facilitating this section again today. A couple of things. One is to allow Chair Grande to fully participate. I'll be calling on members again like I did last time. Since you all were so well prepared last time, we decided this time we didn't need to have a feedback guide and have time for review. So we're just going to go through, as we did last time, each response. As you can see, this time we have CDE and Chancellor's Office staff ready to, I think, address questions and concerns because we feel like we're at that stage now. Jeff and Russ are at the ready. And just to reiterate, Rachel's going to be taking notes. Yes. Oh, thanks. Thanks. Thank you. Just to reiterate, Rachel will be taking notes, and we're making sure that in those notes we have your comments directly on the transition plan. And then if there's something that we want to kind of move over to the overall state plan, we'll be sure to keep track of that separately, so we're not losing any of those thoughts, because I know that was a concern last time, and that can sometimes be the reason we want to try and put everything in this transition plan. But if we're really being clear about what's going to be in the state plan and keeping track of that, we're going to make sure to do that today. And yeah, I think just to reiterate the point that as I've been hearing from the planning committee, staff from both the department and the community colleges have been working really closely together, as opposed to last time. I think we drew out that it was more of a CDE right and California Community Colleges review. This time it's really been a collaborative process, and that's what you're seeing in the document.
yeah,
So,
excuse me.
yeah.
So that's one thing I really wanted to reiterate is I appreciated Jeff and his staff helping with this. It was really, truly a collaborative process. As I wrote things, I would email them across the pond to Community College Chancellor's Office and back and forth, and to make sure I captured what they had thought too.
I think even some in-person, the rare in-person
And a couple of in-person meetings as well, yeah.
Great. Okay, so without further ado then, let's move on to implementing career and technical education programs and programs of study.
As you take a breath,
Yes.
Vice Chair Sun has a
Yes. Vice
Yeah,
Chair Sun.
I apologize. Before we get into the nuts and bolts and meat of this document, I just wanted to clarify that in the past, when we've submitted something to the Federal Department of Education, it's been the State Board of Education as the state education agency. So the submission of this, and I see that California Department of Education Community Colleges, is this a submission from the State Board, the CDE, or both? Or I'm not quite sure who the technical agency is, because it will have to be signed off, I believe, by the State Board.
Yeah, technically, CDE is the sole state agency responsible for Perkins, but under an interagency agreement with California Department of Ed and the Chancellor's Office, we share those funds across the agencies. In the past, we have had both the BOG and the State Board of Education approve our state plan. The title page that you see here that I've presented that has CDE and Chancellor's Office is exact copy of the last state plan we did. I just stole the cover from that and used it in that regard. And that's the way it was submitted the last time.
So Russ, just to clarify, you said in the past, the State Board and the BOG have approved the plan. That's the same thing that's going to happen this time around, right?
Yeah, should.
Okay.
So I believe, being California Department of Ed being the sole state agency, it's in Ed code that way, responsible for Perkins, is that the last time we did this, we had the BOG approve the plan first, and then it came to the State Board of Education for final approval, if I remember correctly.
And BOG stands for
Board of Governors.
Board of
Board of
Governors.
Governors. Not everyone listening may know that. So
Then can I ask a process question? Is this on one of the BOG agendas? Either the upcoming meeting in March or the meeting in May?
We're looking to meet the May BOG.
Okay, very good. Thanks, Jeff.
The Maybog.
And same for the state board, correct, May?
Yeah.
In this case, though, with this round, just the way the meetings are set up, it will go to the Department of CDE's board first, state board first, before it goes to the BOG. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, could we just kind of look in the tech, this may have been what was submitted before. I just not sure, having worked on ESSA, it was the state board submission, not the CDE submission. I don't know if Perkins is different, but I would think that the Federal Department of Education would look at an SEA as an SEA, and so that's just something I think technically to look into. Okay.
I'm seeing staff saying they will get clarification on that. Okay, so ready to start diving into the individual responses?
I think so.
All right. So the
Everyone
first programs
ready?
of study question, letter A. Member Costa.
One is just kind of technical, and that first, or pardon me, it's the second sentence that starts with local control allows eligible. I think we're missing a comma after fosters timely responsiveness, comma, regional needs. I'm assuming those are separate thoughts. And the other thing that I think is kind of missing in this, and it's inferred but it's never said, is we talk about the size of California being one of the driving factors here. It's also the diversity of needs in California. And that is a subset kind of our size. But I think regionally, the needs are quite different, and that should be reflected in this paragraph.
And I'm seeing some heads nodding on that one. Member Rucker.
Oh, okay, so I went to the third sentence beginning with the phrase, while state involvement is needed, with the clause, while state involvement is needed. As you read through the whole sentence, I think there's either a word missing or there's a conjunction and before the word incentivizes that should be deleted. Because okay, so I'm going to apologize for the next part of what I'm about to say. The dependent clause is, while state involvement is needed to provide a statewide vision, develop a policy framework, provide oversight, monitor the attainment of state goals and program effectiveness, and at the same time promote economies of scale, that's the dependent clause. So if that's the dependent clause, there is no independent clause because it doesn't have a predicate. The next part, which should say the sharing of effective practices, I think the word and this comma needs to be deleted, incentivizes cooperative relationships at all levels to maximize student outcomes.
And I should say, I think this is still yet to be sent to department editors and proofreaders. Yes? Still needs that round of review?
We had some editing done in order to be posted on the web.
Right, okay, but more extensive to come.
I'm sure that was in the document and the editors took it out.
Yeah,
Okay, so the reason why I needed to ask if that's what the sentence is supposed to say is because, first of all, let me compliment the staff, and Russ in particular. Each time I say the staff, you know I'm saying you, that this goes a long way toward answering the question. But as this statement clearly states, that while it does incentivize cooperative relationships at all levels, the point has already been made, but the programs of study need to be differentiated, and there are some key criteria that require that differentiation. There's regional priorities and needs, there's information and input provided by the local workforce development boards, but there's a difference in the programs of study available to students in the elementary, middle, and secondary levels at the K-12 system, and that are very different when you start talking about the career pathways and programs that are offered regionally by the community colleges and other funded programs. I think that there needs to be a clear explanation as it relates to the program of study, not only about how those programs of study are differentiated and the criteria that's used for making decisions about those program offerings, but then based on just decisions that have been made in our state about that required collaboration, then how that collaboration then works both regionally and statewide. It doesn't clearly go through when you get to the end of that answer, it begins answering the question, but I think there's a part two that still I'm going to assume is going to be developed or added to to the response.
Thank you, Member Rucker. Yes, Member Ortiz-Lacon.
I just have some general comments. First of all, I think that this is a huge improvement over the previous plan, and I think that we all agree. Ideally, we would have more than the weekend to review this, so please do keep that in mind. I know that we had a very tight turnaround, but to receive it Friday night, weekends, for those of us that are weekend moms, you know, that's kind of a special time. So I was trying to read this last night and this morning. But in this particular, I understand this is a transition plan, and so I'm going to leave my level of rigor when it comes to the special populations and really getting a little bit more detailed on how we plan to narrow achievement gaps and opportunity gaps. I will definitely be looking for that for the actual plan, although I do have comments about the special populations later on. This first part here, I think that if I wasn't from California, I wouldn't necessarily know what we're talking about. It's very much written in a California way. So when we're talking about local control funding formula and the new funding formula for the community colleges, that is there's no explanation beyond there's these new formulas, right? And so this is not a state plan. This is a plan that will be approved at the federal level for the state. But we need to consider the audience. And so maybe, I'm not saying define every single one of these initiatives, but maybe a statement that says all of these initiatives are geared at providing additional funding, bringing equity, you know, just something that summarizes what's in common between all of these accountability systems and initiatives and weighted formulas that we're referencing, because I think we're doing it to show that we're positioned for it. But there's nothing here. I'm not that acquainted with the new community college formula, and I'm still not, right? And so there's nothing here that further describes why this matters. Thank you.
Yeah.
Heather, I was wondering if maybe instead of just describing new funding formula for community colleges in California, we would insert after the word new, student-centered funding formula, and then use SCFF, much like LCFF is being used, because the local control funding formula and the student-centered funding formula. It's just a comment.
Member Costa?
I think the theme, though, between both of the funding formulas that we probably should highlight here is that both of them, the underpinning is to actually provide additional funding to those that are disadvantaged. That's certainly what the local control funding formula does. It's actually what the community college new student funding formula does too, which is there are weights based on whether or not you're economically disadvantaged. And so I would just direct staff to maybe include that as a theme here, because I do think it differentiates California from many other states and leads into kind of our broader narrative here about really ensuring that we're providing access for students.
Great, thanks. So that sounds like a reinforcement of Member Ortiz-Lacon's statement of some kind of just introductory statement about the two formulas. Great. Other thoughts on this question?
Before moving to the next question, but moving on to the next page, on page 6, there aren't any line numbers that I can reference you to, but there is an introductory sentence, several bullet points, then a new paragraph. At the end of that paragraph, it indicates, to realize the guiding principles outlined above, California recognizes the importance of the following essential elements of a high-quality college and career pathways. Is it really a high-quality college and career pathways, or elements of high-quality college and career pathways? So is there a singular college and multiple pathways, or is the high quality college and career pathways together? I'm just questioning which it is supposed to be because it would interpret differently. Is it? Okay.
I think we need to take out A because it's multiple pathways.
Really? Okay. Got it. Any other thoughts on this A, which is one of our lengthiest responses here? Okay. So moving on to letter B on promoting continuous improvement in academic achievement and technical, actually BI, academic achievement and technical skill attainment. Member Costa.
I just have a question I really don't know, which is that we know that eligible recipients have to have a minimum of one CTE program of study. And my question is that been the state practice? And I guess I'm just questioning, as we're talking about, creating these robust pathways, how many eligible entities only have one pathway? And is that kind of the best use of the funds versus an eligible entity that might have more than one pathway? And I don't really know the answer.
So under Perkins 4, it was required. That was the first time we really saw a reference to programs of study was under Perkins 4. And under Perkins 4, any eligible recipient of these funds, any agency that got the money, had to provide a minimum of one program of study. So at that time, and I'll speak to what CDE did. I know that community colleges was very similar, but I don't know the details. But in our application for funding for secondary and adult funds, we required local agencies to submit, and we developed a program of study template that showed every course offered in that, I'll call it a career pathway, whether it be a CTE course or an academic course, and by grade level. So it listed all the English class, math class, CTE class, 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, through 2 years of community college. And they had to submit at least one of those completed templates with their application. Many eligible recipients had more than one, and many still do have more. In fact, now with CCPT and CTIG and all that, they have multiple. Many of them have multiple. The problem comes in with rural districts. Rural districts, it's difficult for them to have one complete program of study, let alone multiple. The other issue is that while many agencies do provide multiple programs of study, the CTE individual courses they offer go far beyond the number of full blown out pathways that they offer. They offer a lot of singleton CTE courses, a lot that may only include high school courses and don't have a local community college that they have interagency agreement or a collaborative dual enrollment with or anything. But certainly everybody has to submit a minimum of one.
So, thank you. So Member Costa's question really brings up something else in mind. May not necessarily pertain to this transition plan because we need to get this approved and moving forward, but to looking ahead on the metrics on what would be defining a quality CTE program and how we measure that. And our landscape has changed quite a bit, and so that the metrics will be coming in, and I think we need to take a look at that once we're done with this transition plan on the larger plan, Perkins plan, that we're going to need to complete. Is we need to come to agreement. Well, what is, to answer your question, where do we prioritize? Is it the programs that have more than one, or is it the programs that we want to build with rural, just to even get them to get one really strong one going? And so those are questions we have to ask as we're working on this plan, and we need to bring some of those conversations back again.
Great, thanks. Member Rucker.
One of the most important statements that I appreciate in response to this item is in the last paragraph that identifies the ways or the options the state would like the flexibility to pursue on how the plans are going to be approved. And the reason why I like this statement is because you're giving yourself the flexibility to flesh this out with the full development of the state plan itself, rather than making an explicit commitment to how program approval will happen in the transition. The one thing that I do want to make sure we pay attention to is, as we get down to those nuts and bolts, I do believe that what will emerge is that there will be some distinctiveness in what the community college system does for approving those programs of studies, because that is already in place with a number of very explicit entities, and what the role will be for county offices of education along with school site councils in approving programs of study when you look at K-12 programs. So I think that that does need to be made explicit in the state plan, but it probably does not have to be as completely spelled out for the transition plan. I do like the way you put that together here, and maybe just add a sentence to say that there are some distinctive elements or some distinctive agencies in each of the two systems that will have to be involved in that process. Maybe adding a sentence like that to make it clear that we recognize that.
Yeah, and we've done a lot of work with the UCCI on integrating academic instruction and CTE instruction in individual courses, but then we've also worked with Butte County Office of Education with CTE Online, developed a multitude of programs of study or fully developed career pathways linking secondary and post-secondary education that are available to anybody. I think it's important to note that one significant change between Perkins 4 and Perkins 5 is the fact that in Perkins 5, it really talks about state-adopted or state-approved programs of study. Being a local control state, that makes it somewhat difficult for us. And I think what we're going to have to look at in light of that requirement is probably developing some model programs of study that are somehow approved by the state, saying we recognize these as high quality programs of study, and tell local agencies you're welcome to adopt or adapt these programs of study to your local or regional use. But Perkins 5 does require the state to actually make available to local agencies approved programs of study. So it's a little bit different tweak on the language.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I went back and read that part of the statement in the statute. And are there ways that we could even suggest that our framework will inform or creates the criteria for local agencies, since we are a local control state? Those would be the guiding principles that would guide the decisions that local entities would make in creating these programs. So we have a state-approved framework. So if the programs are aligned to that framework, they would be, as they are submitted for funding, they would become state-approved for that reason, because you've already stated in the criteria, we have very explicit criteria for what is high-quality programs, and that's spelled out in our framework. And maybe just drawing the line, the connecting points from A to B to C, that includes the framework as part of that explanation, may go a long way to saying this is the way we certify these as state-approved programs because of our criteria that includes our framework.
Yeah, that's correct. I think that's probably the best approach for us to do.
I'm going to be a bit of a contrarian on that point. And this may be more appropriate for the full-fledged plan versus the transition. But, we've done a lot of regional work, too, through WIOA and through our strong workforce. And there's part of me, as somebody who really likes local control and subsidiarity, you could reverse it and actually have those regions submit up to the state some of their work that could be disseminated more statewide. I think we have invested a lot of resources for regions to really work on what they need. And so another way to approach it would be bottom up.
And that's a little bit what we do now with CTE Online, is we allow locals and regionals to work together and develop programs of study and actually individual course curriculum, and then post it at CTE Online and make it available to everybody. But I think really a combination of that. I think probably the extent the state could do is develop a framework for developing a high-quality program of study, and just let locals and regional entities know that if you're going to develop a program of study that's acceptable, you must follow this framework. So I think that's a great idea.
Framework could potentially be reflective of some of what's happening in the.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so that'll be a really
And
important.
we could just include that new framework within the, embed that within the full plan. And then I think that if we did that, I think it would be acceptable to the feds. In some cases, they look at states that don't have local control, and they want the state to dictate the programs of study. You know, they want the state to develop a high-quality program of study in auto mechanics, and if you're going to have everybody do that. We don't do that here. Many other states do not do that as well, but I think when you read the current Perkins language, it kind of implies that, but there are ways around that. I think developing a framework and saying, no, we require all agencies submitting a program of study to align with this framework, and as long as they align with that and it works well in their local area or their regional area, then that's fine with us as a state.
That'll be an important point in the overall
I
state
think so,
plan.
yeah.
Any other thoughts on this one?
It's just a general question for responding to small letter B, describe the process and criteria. As we're looking at subdivision I and II, are we supposed to have both process and criteria as part of the response to each of the subdivisions? So do we read that down into each of them? Is that the way that we should be evaluating it? So the prompt on small letter B is describe the process and criteria to be used for approving locally developed programs of study. And then letter I, promote continuous improvement in academic achievement. So am I supposed to read that down as to describe the process and criteria for which we would approve locally developed programs that promote continuous improvement in an academic? Yes.
Yeah.
Very good.
Yes.
Because in that case, I noticed that in small letter I, we've done both of those things. We've described both the process and the criteria, but when we're moving to the second one, I don't necessarily see both components. So I was just wondering if I'm supposed to be reading it down.
So I think the way it reads is that you describe the process and criteria used for approving locally developed programs of study, et cetera, et cetera. Then it says will. Then at that point, you jump to item number 2, expand access to career technical education.
So I don't need to describe the process by which the programs will expand access to career and technical education.
Not within the response to II.
Okay. Thank you.
And I would add that most of the questions the feds present, they present them like that, so that you have a full paragraph, and then when they have a bullet underneath, you read that one statement, answer that part of it, then you go back to the main paragraph and then jump. It's kind of the way they do it.
Thank you, Russ.
Member Rucker.
I think the overall context that also has to be applied in understanding these responses is that there was a purposeful change on program accountability in Perkins 5. We're used to talking about fiscal accountability with rules about supplement, not supplant, and maintenance of effort, but there's actually a funding accountability in Perkins 5 that's different, because these questions are specifically making the state be purposeful in deciding how they're going to direct the funds in a way that has an impact in 2 ways: improving the types of programs that are offered, but also improving the outcomes for the students who participate in those programs. So as I read the response to item 2, I really saw what they were asking is the state being purposeful in overseeing and ensuring the implementation of programs that will create these kind of access and outcomes for students? So that was more a funding accountability question that this question was intending to ask California to do a deeper dive on. So I was kind of happy with the way this question was framed in its response. And Russ, if I misstated that, please correct me, because I don't want to be wrong in what I'm explaining.
Oh, you're right. Thank you.
Okay, so we've essentially moved into letter B, Roman numeral 2. Other comments on this response?
Well, since you mentioned it, it should be here about 1 o'clock, and then we will be able to move to lunch.
Yes, our apologies. Lunch is a little bit delayed, so we're going to be forced to work through without. Yes, member Lou. Yep.
So I like what my colleagues were saying about what Russ was saying this too, about having a state-approved criteria, but then the regional, from the regional areas, markets, we're getting some of the quality model pathways, right? But I think when I'm looking at expand access, it's not just expand quality pathways, but also some guidance on making sure there's an equitable lens when looking at who your students are in each of those pathways, right? So I want to know, what is our plan? Because we could say, look, yes, that's exactly what we're saying you should do, you ought to do, but it's not necessarily what's happening in practice. So it'd be great for us, as part of that framework, also something that provides guidance from the state level on how do you monitor, how do you check, implement something that is actually adhering by that spirit of expanding access by making sure you keep an eye on your special populations. What are some best practices when doing that? So I would like to see that practice piece, not micromanaging, but just some tips on how to do that when they're implementing these high quality career pathways. Thank you.
Other thoughts on letter B, Roman numeral 2?
The only overarching statement I wanted to give huge accolades to Russ for being so forward-thinking on each of these and telling us what we're going to do next. We will continue to do these things. We will go out and ascertain more information. And I like that response because it is a transition. It's not our permanent plan. And I like the idea that at the end of each of these, it's where we're going to go next.
Member Costa.
Yeah, just one point on access, and this is really just a preview for when we get until the full-blown plan, and it's a personal philosophy. Access doesn't mean just informing students that the pathway is available to them. It doesn't even mean getting them to enroll. True access means that they're successful in the program, and that's part of what the underpinning of our new funding formula is. And it's not enough as an open enrollment institution simply to say, hey, we take the top 100% of all students that come to community colleges. It's ensuring that there aren't inequitable outcomes for those students based on their ethnicity or socioeconomic status. And so as we move forward, I want to make sure, at least from my point, it's not just about, hey, we have all of these websites telling you about CTE's offerings. It's making sure that we get people the certificate or the educational goal at the end of the program.
Great, thanks. And I think that reinforces Member Ortiz-Lacon's point, and I see lots of nodding heads. So definitely an important point for the state plan. Some snaps happening.
I think in the full plan, some of that may come out too in when we get into answering questions in the accountability section, where they may not be real clear here, but I think in the full, because that's not required in the transitional plan, but I think in the full plan, we'll make that really clear in that portion.
Monitoring to make sure that.
Absolutely, yeah.
Any other thoughts on this one? Okay, then moving on to letter B, Roman numeral 3, inclusion of employability skills in programs of study and career pathways. This is a succinct statement. It seems like members all feel good about this one. So we'll move on to C, the very long prompt for Roman numeral 1, and the response.
Just, we kind of said this at the last meeting, but I'm really hoping we make some progress here. And I think you could only answer with what we have available, and you did a fine enough job, but we need better tools, I think, really to push out the information to our students. You know, we have some, but I think they need to be updated.
There was a comment that I made at the last one as well. If we could just update on the Strong Workforce Program and Doing What Matters, there are now 115 community colleges.
Thank you. Other thoughts on this one?
There's just a question regarding language. On page 11, after guided pathways, there's a paragraph, and within that paragraph, there is the fourth line down, an assortment of state, regional, and local sources, including email notification, listservs. Is there supposed to be a comma after local, and is listservs appropriate list and serves, or is it together as one word? Because isn't a listserv an item? So I was just wondering if that's what we were trying to say.
Might be one word, I don't know.
Double check that, and I think you're right that the comma shouldn't be there.
Okay. And once again, kudos to the feedback mechanism that we have on each of these responses. I really enjoy that. I look forward to seeing what is going to make it into the final plan after this transition year.
If I may, under guided pathways, there are many programs in the community colleges, but we envision or see guided pathways as more of a framework than a program. So to say guided pathways a program may be somewhat short of our intention for guided pathways. So preferably the word program can be changed to a framework if possible. And then for course completion and graduation from the community college or a community college. Minor stuff, but.
And Member Rucker.
My only other question on this was more a program question, not a resource question. But one of the things that's not made clear here, or at least spelled out, there are some collaborative relationships that some community colleges have for dual enrollment programs that's not really included in this response. And I'm not really sure how to write that out or to highlight that and call it out as an explicit example. The reason why that's important is because with dual enrollment and all the different ways now that California gives as options for high school and community college districts to create dual enrollment programs, with each successive new option, it becomes more expansive of a way to include career technical education pathway programs and not just academic programs for English language arts or math. So I think that including that or figuring out a way to include that as a more expansive option, again, gets to that program accountability that you speak to and elaborate on in the questions we're going to get to later. So I don't know how to write that into and keep it with the theme and with the frame that you put together in this question in your response, but I do think that that's something that should be considered for addition, because that's something we're actually doing quite well now with all the options that have been added for dual enrollment.
Ditto to that. That's a subject very close and near to me, and I think it deserves a bullet like the CT online or guided pathways. That's its own, if not a full section on dual enrollment, middle college, early college, or advanced ed. I think we're talking across systems or tapping into each other, and to not list dual enrollment, I think is not adequate.
Just to note a little bit further down in the document, we do talk about dual enrollment and more detailed, because there's a specific prompt from the feds. So maybe we can just kind of highlight it in this response and then refer to the more robust answer that comes on page 12.
Yeah, maybe one suggestion would be to put a bullet up there speaking about dual enrollment and talk about things that like strong workforce and CTIG and the CCPT that happened a few years ago, and how that really encouraged agencies to collaborate and develop dual enrollment programs, and maybe just a short brief bullet that would kind of point to those state policies and that we've put in place over the last few years.
Okay.
That might be helpful.
Okay, that's one way to go, but since this question specifically says that it's available to students, representatives of secondary and post-education, and special population. The reason why I was bringing up dual enrollment, particularly with the examples that Dr. Fan gave, those programs, as they were added on, what they specifically did was increase the diversity of the type of students that took advantage of dual enrollment programs. So I think it's an opportunity to say that the state purposefully implemented those type of dual program options in order to expand the access of special populations and targeted student groups to ensure that they also had access to options for dual enrollment. I think that would be the reason to add a bullet for dual enrollment and to specifically say that the state has created multiple options for dual enrollment to accomplish this outcome.
Yeah, perfect. I hope somebody wrote down exactly what you just said. All right, good.
She's
I like
feverishly typing. Member Ortiz-Lacon.
Yes, I want to bring up again that we should cite the languages. We tend to put materials in languages spoken by at least 15% of a student population. So again, here it says, and to the extent practical, provide the information and resources in a language students, parents, and educators can understand. So I know for K-12, we aim to do that, and I think we should take credit for doing that. In this portion of the plan or of the transition plan, I feel like from C2 to C7, that's the core of what this plan is. And all of those were not required in the transition plan. But I think that that is going to be something that we should definitely focus on, even if it's not required. It talks about collaboration. It talks about using labor market data. It talks about access to the approved career and technical education and quality pathways. So all of those that are not required, I think for me, is what I was looking forward to reading more about, because I think that's the heart of this plan. Thank you.
Which would those be a big feature of this?
Oh, yeah,
plan?
huge for the state plan. Yeah.
So yes, foreshadowing, we now are, no more comments on that last one, right? Okay. So there's a number of responses now that are not required. So we'll be moving over to letter D on dual or concurrent enrollment programs.
The only thing I would note is that the Holden legislation that is referenced in this section actually requires the community colleges that are engaged in these partnerships to report out some demographic information to the chancellor's office. So it might be worth just kind of listing. I mean, we actually know how many students are being served by that legislation. We may or may not want to include it. I don't know what level of detail is appropriate.
Member Rucker.
This section was the reason why I recommended for the previous section that you add a bullet on dual enrollment. I think that the Ed Code citation you give talks about the authorization for dual enrollment programs and the partnership, but there are differences. There are different options that are provided for in statute beyond this. And so that's the reason why I had made the comment in the previous bullet that those different options were added for the purpose of broadening the access. So to the point that was made by Member Costa about this item, so while this item does say we offer dual enrollment, it does not talk about or it doesn't recognize that there are differences. It's not uniformly implemented. There are differences in access that we are purposefully aware of. And there are also differences among all the regional programs, different levels of success that are really personality or individually driven that are not set by the system. So I think a statement needs to be added here that we recognize those particular local pressures and that we're looking at using this state plan and the accountability for assuring that access to look at ways to not only systematize looking at dual enrollment, but how to create the sustainability that lives beyond those personal relationships that created those programs in the first place. I think that a statement like that probably needs to be considered or added, because there's been an ebb and flow over time about those programs, and that ebb has been driven by somebody retiring and no longer continuing or sustaining that relationship. And we need to look at what sustainability looks like as part of the system and not as part of the individual agreements.
And if I could add, I think that might be a good time to go back to our principles and maybe quoting something about the direction of where the state wants to go, because we do talk about the intentionality of sustained investments and coming back to about ensuring that we do have that cohesion in the student-centered delivery services, multiple entry points. So we started really strong with the principles at the beginning of the document, and then as we responded, it might be nice at this point in time to bring them back in again, referencing.
Member Fan.
Under response, I think I have a problem with the use of too many commas here, but new accountability and continuous improvement may not need a comma. But maybe someone inform me, please, that as part of the system, the college and career indicator identifies 8 measures as indications of college and career readiness. Do we know what those 8 measures are? I do, okay. Is it listed in here, or?
I did not list all 8. I think what I referred to is the 2 that were most important of the 8.
Okay. So what are the other 6, if I may? I'm not informed of that.
Me either. Sorry. That happened after I retired. They came to that. But
so these 8 are established by the CDE. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So I guess we as community college don't need to know that, huh?
And the way
or maybe somebody do.
We should have it all so we all understand.
Well, I think the way I understand it, that's not fully fleshed out yet either. I mean, they've got 8, but they're looking at adding more or changing. Yeah.
Just for the benefit of the public, and Patricia can interrupt, I think the State Board of Education's done a lot of work on the indicators, but there's more work that they're planning to do on the career readiness indicators, which would probably be the most relevant in this context. And so there's 2, but more to come, I think.
Okay, I just raised that because I don't know the 8, and we're submitting something, and typically when you put a number, you got to know yourself what those items are. Just my thought.
Member Ortiz-Lacon.
Yes, and to your point, we will be having a meeting in May to further discuss that indicator. So it may be more than 8. Right now, the metrics includes like CLO by literacy. So maybe we shouldn't quantify it because it will evolve. So maybe we're calling it college and career. To be determined. It's still college/career at this point, but we should have a better understanding in May.
I guess 2 options. I could identify the current 8, or I could just take out the reference to the quantity. So remove the word 8 and just say that we have measures.
Yes.
I think maybe 2, the sentence that says completing a CTE pathway and earning credit in a college course are 2 of these 8. You could maybe start by saying 2 of the, not 8, but 2 of these are particularly relevant to something like that might help.
Yeah, I think the other point to be made about the college and career indicators, this is not meant to be an indicator that operates at the student level. This is how we are holding the system accountable for creating access and then measuring the participation of students at the system level in the access that's been provided. So the metric itself holds us accountable not only for the outcomes and the information we have about students, but it helps districts to pay attention to what that all student issue, how that all student metric is being met. So taking out the information that quantifies how many elements is probably a good idea, but maybe adding a sentence that says, this is how the state is deciding or choosing to hold each of these levels of the K-12 system accountable for creating this access as students matriculate through the system and transfer or transition over to the K-12. That maybe adding a sentence about that level of accountability, again, keeping that through line about our purposeful accountability and how we're looking at this as not a moment in time, but as a moment over time. That might be a good way of thinking about how to explain that.
Other thoughts on this one? Okay, so again, we're going to skip a few here that didn't have required responses and move over to letter H on page 14, talking about size, scope, and quality.
One comment I just have is the guiding principles, great document. I think it mostly speaks to quality, though. I don't really think the guiding principles reference size and scope of the programs in my reading of them. So I don't know that it's appropriate to say that that's how we define those things. It really more is about quality and aspiration for what we hope the pathways are.
Yeah, I can certainly, if the committee would so choose, I could actually move that statement to more of the section on quality, because I've kind of written these in paragraphs about size, scope, and quality, try to do it that way. And I can certainly move that reference more to the quality section, if that works best.
Yes, Member Ortiz-Lacon, did you have something, or was that what you were going to suggest? Okay, great. Member Rucker.
And this is my opportunity to say, at the time when I read the first draft, I didn't really understand what was being asked for in describing size, scope, and quality. I understood what scope was, who that was supposed to cover, and access. And I even understand quality because we have criteria that define high quality programs, but I'm still not really sure I understand how size is supposed to be addressed, because that's relative. If you're in a rural program and you are working to offer one high quality program, how do you explain or quantify or put a criteria on size? Is it size relative to the students that are enrolled in that district? Is it size relative to the successive approximation towards 100% participation? I still don't understand what the term of art size is actually supposed to be referencing, or is it size relative to even the impact of the program in the community with the workforce or the employers who would benefit from that program being in place? So even when I went through the documents that were provided or tried to read that guidance that continues to evolve from our good friends at the feds, I don't understand that. So I actually think in the answer you wrote in the second draft, it helped me to understand more, but I don't actually understand that still.
Yeah, and I think all states struggle with how to define size. And so I've done some research on that and found that some states actually define, if you don't address and they quantify the number of pathways you must address in a high school program, and if you're not addressing, and that's how they define size, and then those agencies or schools that are in a small rural area that maybe only have one pathway, they could have 100% participation, but only have one pathway, then in that particular state, they wouldn't fund that program with Perkins because it doesn't meet their size definition. And I believe in California, we need to avoid that. And really, to me, size is, really speaks to, or it relates to the size of your agency. It relates to this, the regional need for that particular pathway completers and so forth. So it's really kind of a relevant term, and I think we've struggled with size, scope, and quality ever since Perkins 3. So.
Well, and I appreciate the way that you tried to explore that here, because again, I didn't really understand what was being asked for with the first draft, and I have a clearer picture in the way you developed this narrative here. I would recommend we stick with the idea of relativity rather than trying to give a specific criteria, because what that does is it will favor some eligible entities over others. And then we will lose or narrow our definition then of what access or even equity among all of our eligible entities could be. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, I think we need to avoid trying to quantify size.
Can we do that by the use of the word to scale? Yeah, I see that they use the word size, scope, and quality, but at the community colleges, we typically don't talk about sizes. We talk about how we can scale or bring things to scale. And I don't know if we can actually address the Fed's question by the use of that word, so we can perhaps eliminate quantity.
So one thing we might do in that, to reference that, is to actually talk about bringing these programs at the local level to such a scale that it meets local and regional workforce needs.
Perfect.
I was just going to confer with what they said about size to my earlier point about if it's just one program, I wouldn't want to exclude any smaller districts either on the community college side or the K-12 side from participation. Scope, though, I think we've missed an opportunity to talk about the regional need assessment that is happening, because when I see scope, I think if you're a local entity, your scope of program should be aligned with what your regional workforce need is. And we actually, we've done a lot of work in that recently in the last couple of years. And so I think maybe we should reference that as a state. We are working on scope by aligning kind of those regional workforce needs with program offerings.
And I think also it will be made clearer in the final state plan, because locals are actually required to do a local needs assessment and submit that along with their application. So as the state works with those local entities to work through that local and needs assessment, it'll be clearer in here.
Thanks. Other comments on this one? Chair Grande.
I really appreciated the reference to the guiding principles document and its inclusion in here. So thank you, Russ. I did have one other comment on the section B, down towards the bottom of page 14. It's actually at the top of page 15. The bullet point says be staffed by qualified CTE teachers, meaning teachers who. In the second bullet under that bullet, it references Title V of the California Administrative Code, and I was wondering if that's the appropriate title to the California Code of Regulations.
We'll have to check that.
Okay, thanks.
Can you use V instead of the number 5, because I think that's consistent with.
It actually is Title V, the numerical number Title V.
Oh, really? Not V anymore?
No, Ed Code is Title V with the V.
Thank you. I learned.
Any other thoughts on this one? It's another extensive response. Okay. So we're going to move on to the section on meeting the needs of special populations. Yeah. Once, we're going to take a quick check to see if lunch is here before we move on to a new section. We could all use some brain food. Not yet.
Special populations it is.
Special populations it is.
So it might be dinner.
Or dinner, is that between lunch and dinner is dinner? I'm not sure. Okay, so question A, Roman numeral I, will be provided with equal access to activities assisted under this act. Member Ortiz-Lacon.
I'm wondering if I know, for instance, in K-12, we have about 25% English learners in our student population. What is the percent of English learners that are participating in career pathways? I think it would be good for us to know, like, if these are our special populations, what percent are we currently serving, just so that we have a better understanding as we're developing our model career pathways and frameworks on how to monitor and how to keep an eye on this. I think it would just be really good information for us to know that students with disabilities, others, I'm not sure if you all capture that information. For instance, out of workforce individuals. We know we have homeless individuals, foster youth. It would be good to know what K-12 has, what data points, and what data points community college has, and then start putting some numbers so that we understand where are we at.
Yeah, I don't know how that information now is disaggregated. Because I'm thinking when I used to work here, I guess I came back now, so I'm still working here, but when we used to report it to the feds, we reported it under one big category of special populations. And so if a student was met multiple criteria, they were only counted once, so it wasn't a duplicate count. But I'm not sure how the state must have it more disaggregated than we submit it to the feds. But I think that would be very interesting to look at and see how that would fit in. And I think the more disaggregated we could get the data, the better. But
I think there's also an opportunity to look at the types of support that's also provided to students from the Student Aid Commission. There may be some data there. And the reason I'm suggesting that is because of the Cal Grant B and C, as well as the Chafee grants that are provided that are for specific student populations. The Chafee grant is a specific student population. Cal Grant C is a specific student population. Cal Grant B is a specific student population. So it may be there's some additional data about how we target and provide supports for students from particular student populations that particularly show up at the community college, that the Student Aid Commission may be able to actually provide some data that might be helpful on this point.
Member Costa.
I have a question and a comment, which is the bullet that says individuals preparing for non-traditional fields. I need an example of that. Like I, as a white woman, if I want to go into pottery.
So that would be.
But that's underrepresented, which is, I think, slightly different than just saying an individual preparing for non-traditional fields.
And in nursing, women in funeral service. That's where our categories are on our campus.
Really?
Yeah.
So these are terms actually right out of the Federal Perkins Act. The bullets are. It's the way they're defined within that piece of legislation. They would interpret that like a male in nursing or a female in welding.
Okay. And then Patricia was right, always. And then secondarily, I'm wondering why, and maybe it is because it's the federal Perkins law, incarcerated individuals aren't on here, and it is in the budget later and as one of the eligible groups, and why we don't have them listed as a special population.
Yeah, well, and Perkins does provide funding for incarcerated adults and youth, both. They just don't define those specifically within special populations. And in fact, the last bullet on here that talks about youth with a parent who's in the armed forces is a brand new identified special population within Perkins that was not there before. ESSA.
Vice Chair Sun, did you have something a while back?
What I was going to say is something around the data pieces. I was originally thinking, oh, we could probably pull the information that member Felisa Ortiz-Lacon asked. But I'm remembering now that I think under CalPADS and where the state collects is student population designation, special population, but on the career, the CCI, I believe the department only collects the one, if they meet one of the indicators, then that's it. So we could be missing some information, and just goes back to our data systems needing to be more robust, so.
And did you have something?
Yeah, I had the point earlier about incarceration or veterans and international students, but I guess it's been captured already.
Heather, on this list, most of the people listed here or categories are gender neutral, except for the single pregnant women. Can that be changed to single pregnant person or persons? Yes, it made the front cover of People magazine when he gave birth.
Now, because these are the federal,
They're worded exactly like, I just pulled them right out of the act and pasted them in here. I mean, I could certainly change that.
I'm just wondering if it would be more appropriate. We are California.
Might be for
We
California.
have M, F, and X on our driver's license
That's
now.
right.
Since we're asking money from the Fed, I just go with the Fed's word.
other thoughts on letter A, Roman numeral I? All right. Letter A, Roman numeral 2, will not be discriminated against on the basis of status as a member of a special population. Any comments on this one? Member Rucker.
Okay, so I appreciate the language. This is not new. This is information you usually read in most of these types of grants and applications. It's not, while it's not a cliche, it definitely has become a trope. But I think that this is an opportunity for me to work out my own personal pain, because there's a disconnection between what the paperwork may say and what the actual practices are. I love my alma mater, UC Davis, but let me just be real clear. When you're a student of color and you're going to the University of California, it doesn't matter if you happen to be a high-achieving student. They're going to look at you and see that you're a student of color, and they're going to ask you, are you an EOP student? So there are practices in programs and at universities that are discriminatory on their face and that are institutionalized. I'm not really sure, even though we promise we won't do bad things, it doesn't change the fact that there are practices that have become so institutionalized that people don't even recognize that these are discriminatory practices. So while I really do applaud the clarity with which you wrote this response, we need to be real in understanding, particularly as it relates to this particular conversation, that there are practices that we do need to use this plan either to provide training, either to improve awareness, or even to directly state that there are some practices we are aware of that through the implementation of this program we need to pay attention to and understand how to change or address. I think that does need to be stated. And to my other colleagues on the panel, if I made you uncomfortable, I'm sorry.
Oh, not at all.
And Member Rucker, are you suggesting here, or is that something that might be able to be in the larger state plan? Okay, thanks. Member Ortiz, looking
On the record, you didn't make me uncomfortable. I'm with you, Patricia.
Here, and I agree. I mean, I think that we could say we're going to uphold civil rights, we're going to uphold the law, the policies, but at the end of the day, a lot of it is in practice. But for this this sentence here, can we add sexuality? So race, color, national origin, sex, sexuality, and disability. Thanks. The first one, existing state policies require eligible recipients. Yeah.
Member Fan?
Russell, whoever wrote this, I guess you've been reading William Faulkner too much. I think he wrote one book with, in one sentence, 9 pages. So the last sentence in that middle paragraph there, I maybe some hyphens instead of commas, because there's way too many commas. Okay. But what is CTSO?
Career Technical Student Organization. And I don't know if that came up earlier in the document.
I haven't.
I think it might have.
Okay. Well,
yeah.
It's earlier in the document?
Yeah, earlier in the document.
It probably would behoove the reader to just
when I'm piecing this together, I kept, writing them all out and then realized, no, I need to start using acronyms, but then where does the first appearance of that happen? And so I might have missed that. So this might be the first appearance of it and didn't spell it out
On
here.
page 8.
Okay, okay, there it is. Yeah. I struggle with that because these are individual sections, and I wrestled with the thought of maybe I need to spell out these acronyms in each section rather than just at the beginning.
Okay.
It might be clearer if, I use the full spelling in each section and then show the acronym again. Because actually when the feds read these, they actually may tear them apart, and the accountability person may read the accountability
the point.
section. The
Yes.
fiscal person might read the fiscal section. So it might be in our best interest to actually spell them out in each section rather than just at the beginning of the document.
Thank you.
Agreement in that idea.
Yeah.
Okay, other comments on, oh, I've lost track. Letter A, Roman numeral 2. Okay, thanks. Okay, so a few more with no response required, or just one more with no response required. Okay, so letter A, Roman numeral 4. Really starting on page 20, appropriate accommodations. Member Costa.
Again, it's just a question for my own edification, which is that we reference kind of midway through page 20 that we'll continue to use our section 112 funds to support Joint Special Populations Advisory Committee. And then it kind of bullets out the different things they do. I'm just not familiar with this body, and I guess my question is it working? Do we think this is the best mechanism to support our special populations?
Yeah. So the Joint Special, let me read it properly. The Joint Special Populations Action Committee, often referred to as JSPAC, is funded through Perkins. They hold 2 conferences each year for professional development for faculty and administrators to become aware of the needs of special populations as they are funded by Perkins.
Ortiz-Lacon.
When that, just to give you a little bit of history, when that committee was first formed years ago, I believe under Perkins 3, may have even been Perkins 2 when we began funding that, it was really focused on non-traditional. So it was really getting females into more male occupations and vice versa. But then over the years, it's really transitioned over to address all special population students. And they have a relationship with NAEP at the national level, National Association of Partnerships and Equity. So they have a relationship with them. They have cross-representation from secondary, post-secondary, and business partners attend those meetings. And it's really focused on really addressing equity and access pretty much within Perkins funded programs, because Perkins funds that committee, but they really have robust conversations about education in general, in fact. So.
Ortiz-Lacon.
This advisory committee was referenced in the previous draft of the plan, so I just started searching and exploring, and they have really good resources. I had never heard of them before, though. So they had an entire module with videos on DACA students and how to support DACA students in the community college and through different career pathways and internships. And I thought, well, this is great, but how do people know about it, right? And so part of it is, how do we disseminate this? How do we push it out? I definitely started looking at some of the resources to see if I could use them with students that I work with. But I think that it sounds like they have a lot of great resources and supports. It's just trying to figure out how do we make this so that there's mass consumption of their good materials.
Perhaps something else to dig more deeply into for the state plan.
They have a regional board, so it's statewide. They have regional boards. A partnership between K-12 and secondary are on their board, so they're getting communication around pathways And they do a really good job. I mean, who they bring in, the speakers they bring in, it's absolutely amazing. And they do it pretty much on a shoestring budget. I think we give them about a
Member Rucker.
I think this is an opportunity to talk about linkages and coherence because while I was aware of this particular entity and it's very, very important to community colleges, but is this the actual go-to agencies that K-12 programs actually think of and look to for guidance first? And I believe the answer probably is probably not. They probably would look at their SELPAs, or they would look to the Advisory Commission on Special Education, or they would go to the, if they're using the frameworks, they would look at the chapter on universal design and support the types of supports and guidance that are provided. So I think that there's an opportunity here to look at a way to link or at least create bridges among not only the agencies that do this work and that are the lead agencies and have relevance for both parts of our system in different ways, but also to look at the ways that we can, again, use the implementation of this plan to do some bridging between the work, among the work of all of these agencies, not only to make sure that they're receiving a coherent and clear message, but that, you know, the board at their next meeting this week is going to approve a plan concerning compliance and addressing issues that are directly related to and on point to the answer to the response to this item. And that's item 17 in the state's compliance plan that has to be turned in to the Office of Special Education Programs. That acronym is OSEP. So as it, you know, what is written in that plan that is related to or overlaps with the system of support and the work that's being done by the agency that's enumerated here. I'm not saying this to make more work, but I'm saying this to make less work so that we don't have 5 or 6 different plans sitting on a program administrator's desk without them understanding the linkages or the connection among the work that's being done or being required of these eligible entities to do this work. So I would just suggest that we pay attention to or give a sentence that pays attention to our purposeful effort to try to do some bridging among that work. And so as I say this, I'm staring at Tom because he knows whether or not what I'm saying makes sense. And my feelings won't be hurt if you say, no, that's not going to work. Let me tell you why.
Is this working? Good. Actually, I think you bring up a good point about in terms of linkages and how does K-12, and because we're really talking about a community college program and K-12 efforts. And so maybe the thing to think about is in our Perkins 5 plan, how do we make that really more of a reality? And I love the reference to DACA because in that sense, you know, if the K-12 students are going to be going into community college and let's say that status continues, we should have better articulation about that and better communication around that. So it's not just we share the same thoughts, but we actually have a coherent program for serving those type of students.
Other thoughts on this response? So Lisa told me that lunch would be here at 1:20. We're about to head into the next section. Responsibility.
Yeah, now would be a great time for us to take a break.
Yeah, even if lunch is not immediately ready.
Yes.
Let's take a brain break and get up and take care of our needs. And
Thank you so much, Heather. So we will take a small break. It's currently 1:15 p.m.
1:15 exactly, yeah.
Okay, and how about we wrap lunch into this as well and come back in at 2 o'clock to resume our meeting. We are in recess. Okay.
Great, thanks, Chair Grande. We made great progress leading up to our delayed lunch, so we got a lot done. Moving
Heather?
on, yeah.
Oh, I think before we move on, I like to circle back on that list of special populations. What page was that again before we move forward?
Yes.
Yeah, page 17. So help me understand here. These special populations, we need to gather data for, correct? In the new plan? Are we?
The plan actually requires you to serve these special populations, but does not necessarily ask you to gather data by these special populations.
Okay.
The federal requirement is when you submit data to them about serving these particular special population students, you submit that data not disaggregated by these groups, just as a whole special populations category.
So
the only one that's really disaggregated, well, the only indicator that's disaggregated is non-traditional employment is specifically called out, but other than that, no.
So when we serve these populations, then age is not seen here, but since this is a CDE population, if you will, all of these are 18 and below, correct? No?
No.
No. Oh, okay, so they are adults.
Yes.
So at the community colleges, which probably is part of this program, if I'm not mistaken, the populations that we serve, such as veterans, formerly incarcerated or currently incarcerated, would that be part of the special population as well? Because the last bullet is youth with a parent who's a member of the armed forces. We don't have youth. We have veterans. So does that get plugged in here somehow or not? And including the incarcerated population, because we are ramping up our services to this population statewide.
So one suggestion I might make is that we can kind of reword this response a little bit to include, if you look at the sentence just prior to these bullets, California is committed to supporting the special populations as defined in Perkins 5, and those are as defined in Perkins 5. But then I could add another sentence underneath those bullets and said something like, in addition to the following special populations recognized by the state of California. And then we can include some of those that may not appear in this federal legislation. So that would be a suggestion.
Sure, yeah, because I wanted our service at the community colleges to these populations be somehow recognized or included.
Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you.
So I just need to get a list of those, but if I do, then I can include them that way.
I think Jeffrey or somebody from the community colleges could supply that list.
Member Ortiz-Lacon.
And though we are not required to submit data for these special populations, only how we plan to service them, the reason I recommended having some data points is we don't know if we're servicing our special populations unless we're tracking that. And so, again, I think that if we are hoping to really serve these populations, and I know the ones we have here are per Perkins, but there's a lot of overlap for our populations that ESSA has asked us and LCFF. So we have the data, so why not use it appropriately and track? And of course, for our community college colleagues, you'll have other subsets of special populations, but again, it's not required, but we won't really know if we're doing an effective job serving our student populations unless we have some data.
Quick comment from the community college. So yes, we're aware that there are new categories defined by the federal government of special populations, and the community college is currently working to understand the policy definitions and interpret those into data definitions that allow us to collect to be able to report on those. So we are actively engaged in being prepared. and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe that these data sets will be reported until we are in 5, and under 4 we'll be reporting the current Perkins 4 data elements.
Great.
The new elements should be reported in Perkins 5, not under the transition year. I don't think we'll be reporting them this year.
Okay, so I'm going to rephrase what I think I heard you say. For purposes of this plan, for the transition plan, the data that you're going to collect is going to be related to the data sets or the data categories that are currently defined under Perkins 4.
Correct.
And then when we actually are in Perkins 5, after the transition plan has been implemented, is that correct?
Correct. In fiscal
When
year 20.
when we write or submit the full state plan, that's when the more expansive data set will actually be collected and reported.
Yeah, and I think the feds, excuse me, I think the feds set it up that way because the delay in collecting versus reporting.
Okay.
So
Because there's some lagging indicators on what's reported in those data sets.
right,
I'm with you now.
so in other words, the data we report to the feds is really almost 2 years old by the
Right.
time we collect it and
Right.
gather it and sort it. And so they allow you that transition year to use the old data sets because that's really what we have collected.
Mhm.
And then under Perkins, but they're warning you, under Perkins 5, you better start collecting this stuff because under Perkins 5, you're going to have to report it that way.
Okay, I got it.
Great, thanks. Okay, so now we're moving back to page 20. Oh, Member Ortiz-Lacon.
Based on that last comment that you just made, under Perkins 5, we will have to report disaggregated data? Is that what you just said?
I'll have to check to make sure exactly, because I think there is some disaggregated data, but I need to make sure that I don't misstate it and say we collected by all of these that are listed, or if it's just a few of these that are listed.
Because I know I heard you say non-traditional fields, but it just seems odd that under ESSA, we would disaggregate, but for Perkins, it would be a super subgroup, which is just crazy.
So when I referred to non-traditional, there's actually an indicator that stands alone for non-traditional employment. The number of students who are, or the number of students who complete a CTE program and enter into non-traditional employment. So that's a separate indicator. And then if there's any disaggregation, it would be in all the indicators, academic performance, completion, all of that.
Okay, and if you could check, that would be great, but I just.
Yeah, I will.
If we want a coherent sort of approach to our accountability system, it would make sense for us to disaggregate. Thanks.
Any other comments on this one? Okay, so moving to page 21, fiscal responsibility. Question 1A, how each eligible recipient will promote academic achievement. Any comments on this one? Okay, trying to give adequate wait time, but I think that we can move on. Response B, how each eligible recipient will promote skill attainment. Okay, moving on to C, ensuring the local needs assessment. Member Fan.
Yes, on the response, when it says the awarding of certificates of achievement, are these certificates or awards by the community colleges or by the LEAs?
On which page are you looking looking at?
I'm at the bottom of 21 onto 22.
Okay, so back to response
Yeah,
B.
yeah.
Okay. On response B, Jeff or Russ?
Or do we need to be specific?
I believe that is for the community colleges.
For the
because
community
I
colleges.
understand the K through
Okay.
12 don't award that kind of
Okay.
certificate.
Okay. So we don't have to specify the number of units or anything like that. Either it could be 6 units or it could be 18 units, and we want to leave it broad like that, right?
Well, the other thing we might want to look at is changing that and to a and or, because it's not really an and. We don't award end of courses. We don't do end of course assessments and award a certificate in all areas, but it could be one or the other. So that might be helpful as well.
And I believe it has to do with if you look at that statement, it says promote skill attainment.
Mhm.
That's usually associated with certificates of achievement. So I believe that's why it's that specific related to skill attainment.
Okay.
And many of our RLCPs would award a certificate as recognition of having completed the program. And oftentimes those awarded certificates actually have a list of skills that are on the back of that certificate. The students have obtained the following skills, and they list those.
I'm fine with the language. I just want to, for us as the submitter, to be clear when we implement this, that is it like a one course badge or a 6-unit certificate or even an 18-unit certificate. So it gets into the practicality of what we're offering. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Member Fan. Okay, so moving on to response C about the local needs assessment, starting at the top, kind of 3/4 of the way at page 22. Okay, gonna move. Oh yeah, Member Ortiz-Lacon.
I do like adding a requirement that eligible recipients provide evidence that they're adhering by the guiding principles for Perkins 5. So I want to encourage that. Here it's like recommended that they'll be considered. I think it would be great if we could add that.
Great, so something to note for the overall state plan, for sure. Okay.
Sorry. In that second paragraph, can somebody put a comma in there? Sorry, Patricia, but I'm sorry? Okay, please insert a comma in there because it doesn't. In other spaces, I see so many commas, and in this one, it needs a comma, and one is not inserted.
Got tired of them by this point. So. Okay, question 2A, page 23. Moving on. So B, the prompt is at the bottom of page 23 and the response is at the top of page 24. Member Rucker?
Okay, so my question on this one, I didn't have the question, I held the question in response to what was written for 2A. But on 2B, this is what is done currently for the Perkins 4 grants, is that correct? My recommendation would be, again, when we get to the accountability section, there are some differences in how to make some funding determinations that are supposed to be based on the services to the students that are targeted. This is still using some of the current funding practices without that consideration. So I think that there needs to be something about how this may be mitigated or some other factors that will also be considered about either the special populations there will be some additional criteria or some added points in the criteria based on the populations that are targeted or something like that, so that it reflects an update to the funding proposal or the funding practice based on that accountability. Does that make sense?
I don't need that. Oh, I do because of the recording.
You want to come to the podium?
Maybe they went to lunch. You want to go up there?
Yeah.
Maybe just for now, and then they'll come fix.
So the Perkins Act is very specific on how you distribute funds to local agencies. It's required in the Act. So for 131 funds, those are the secondary funds. The funding formula for secondary funds is, I'm echoing. Anyway. Okay. The formula for secondary funds, the way it's defined in the Act, is 30% of the funds are distributed to local secondary agencies based on the student population ages 5 through 17 years old who's enrolled in that agency. So we use 30% of the money, spread it out that way. The other 70% of the money is distributed based on that same student population, but only those who are from special populations, or excuse me, from economically disadvantaged students. So I'm trying to remember now because it's been so long ago. I'll give you a ballpark figure, I guess. So when I was calculating allocations in the past, each student in this state was worth, each secondary student in the state was worth about, I think, $32. Each economically disadvantaged student that schools were serving was like $200 and something. So you get a lot more Perkins money dependent on how many economically disadvantaged students are enrolled in your district schools.
Okay, and so that's what my question is. I didn't ask it as elegantly as you just responded, so I appreciate that. What I'm asking for is an explanation about how the funds are weighted for the allocation of the distribution, and I'm not sure that that was actually as clearly explained in responding to this item. Is based on the guidance, which I was completely confused by, is it a requirement for you to explain the state's weighted student formula on this distribution in this response, or is that just an assumption based on what's required in the statute that it will be distributed based on a weighted student formula?
Yeah, I think in responding to this particular question, you basically have to tell the feds, we're using your formula, or we're going to apply for a waiver to the feds for a different formula. However, if we do that, we have to justify that it's a more equitable distribution based on economic disadvantagement than what the feds formula is. So for instance, on the secondary side of the, post-secondary side of the house for both adults and community colleges, we years ago applied for a waiver of those 132 funds because the feds in the Perkins Act say that you must distribute those 132 funds based on Pell Grant recipients. Well, we realized years ago that that would not provide California with an equitable distribution to adult schools, for instance, ROCPs who serve adults, and in fact, a lot of community colleges. And so we applied for a waiver to the federal government and said, we believe that if we look at counting just the economically disadvantaged adults served by those post-secondary agencies, that provides California with a more equitable distribution of these funds. The feds agreed with that, and hence we got the waiver.
Okay, so for the purposes of the transition plan, I think the way that you've explained this is fine, but I do think something about the differences in the formula based on those two kinds of students probably needs to be added. But the detail that you just explained here is probably something that we need to see in the full state plan.
Okay, great.
And I'm not sure what I personally would rely on you, Russ, to recommend to us which is the better way to do it, because I know that there's a difference, again, that same consideration about how to figure out based on the population the best way to do the distribution. I think that explanation, we would rely on you all because you're going to have the numbers we don't currently have in front of us by that time.
I think the most surprising thing for me when I first started working with Perkins is the way the feds in the act itself defined the distribution of the funds has nothing to do with career technical education.
Yes.
At all. It's really more of an based on economic disadvantagement.
Yeah.
And it's heavily weighted in that direction.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Okay. Just reminding myself where we just left off. We just did B, right? Roman numerals 1 and 2, correct? Okay. So moving on to question 3. Specific dollar allocations made available. Starting at the bottom of page 24. Okay, I'm going to move us on to 4 at the top of page 25. Okay, then down to 5 about adjusting data. Yeah, Russ. Being forced to stretch your legs after lunch.
Test. Oh, there we go. Oh, good. Oh, I forgot what I was going to say.
It was on number 5 at the kind of bottom of page 25.
Oh, this talks about readjustments to data and so forth. What I wanted to say was this really comes to play when we're looking at, particularly in K-12, where we're looking at the number of students who are age 5 through 17 years old that are served by a particular agency. Because when districts unify or break up a unification of a school district, then kids are assigned somewhere else. And so we see changes in data, and we do collect that every year, and we make those corrections in our data calculations. Or if, say, a student is no longer served by a particular district, they're now part of a charter school that serve independent charter school, then those numbers don't apply to that district anymore. They apply to the charter school. And we do make all those statistical adjustments before we do the calculations.
Member Rucker.
Well, I do have a question on that. I believe I heard at our previous meeting that a recommendation or decision had been made that even though there's current flexibility in Perkins 5 to provide funding for programs in the early grades, like at 5th grade, that is not going to be the focus of the funding plan that would be articulated in this state plan? So are you still then going to be reporting and collecting data about students that are in grades that the plan doesn't plan to fund?
Yeah, so what we do when we do calculations for the allocations that go out, we provide allocations to every eligible agency in the state, whether they apply for the funds or not. So then, and most agencies do, but there's a lot of, well, let me go back. So when we do elementary schools, if it's a separate elementary school district and a high school district, and they're separate districts, we have tried to recognize all those feeder districts into that high school district and identified those kids. And when we calculate the high school district's allocation, all of those elementary kids, even though they're coming from a multitude of different districts, are still calculated into that high school district's allocation amount. See, it gets kind of complicated, but
yes.
we do that. And then what we do is we give every agency in the state an allocation, and we post those online, and we say, this is the amount of Perkins money that's available to you. You can apply. Well, elementary districts, if they're not serving, they don't have a program of study, because they have to meet all those requirements, right? So if they don't have a program of study, they're not serving high school kids, they don't have collaborative effort with a post-secondary institution, they may choose not to apply. So let's say they don't apply. We give a preliminary allocation to our secondary and post-secondary agencies who apply and receive and accept, and we receive or approve their application. Then we take all those funds that are left over from agencies who chose not to apply, and we reallocate that or redistribute that among those agencies who did. So then about the middle of the year, all of a sudden they get an adjusted Perkins allocation, and it always goes up because there's always those, what we call released funds. So agencies who did not apply release their funds, they get thrown back in the pot, we run the formula again, and those funds are then reallocated. So we use the full extent of those Perkins funds every year. And then under Perkins, there is no provision for carryover for local agencies. So at the end of the year, if there's any unexpended funds, those funds revert back to the state, then we carry those over into the pot and then redo our formula again, and then that's allocated out. So let's say a big agency like LA Unified releases $1 million for 1 year. They'll get a portion of that 1 million back, but they don't get their whole million back, right? Because a lot of that money is distributed to everybody else. So pennies on the dollar if they have carryover. That's why most of our state agent or most of our eligible recipients try to expend Perkins funds to the full extent if they can.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Your son.
So given that formula of allocation, first of all, this was under the old plan. Do we have to do the same thing under the new plan?
Yeah, it's still required under the new plan. There are a couple of provisions under the new plan that do provide some flexibility, but not with, you know, Perkins requires that at least 85% of your funds have to be distributed to local recipients.
Yep.
So of that other 15%, 5 is for state administration, 10% for state leadership activities. Under the state leadership activities, which is primarily professional development and training, things like that, there are some uses of those dollars that we have a little bit of flexibility with. For instance, one of those uses could be teacher preparation, so preparing new teachers to enter those fields, right? One is they also have a provision that we can put out grants for innovative practices and things like that, but only for those dollars that are in that 10% leadership fund category.
So a couple of questions then, following up to your answer. Then what happens if you're kind of allocating the approximation of what LEA who might apply might get? What happens with charter schools or districts that might be shifting and all of that. So how do you do that with?
So usually that if some agency comes into the game, well, if you come into the game too late, you've kind of missed the cycle, and we welcome you the next cycle. And oftentimes we have to do that because there's requirements for them to do, like in Perkins 5, there's a requirement for a needs assessment. Well, if you're a charter school, you have yet to complete a needs assessment. There's no way you can turn in an application for the funds. But what we'd say is use this year to do your needs assessment. Next year, apply for the money. You're alerting us ahead of time that you're going to apply. So we'll do an allocation for you next year because we know you're going to apply. But we have had incidences where an agency just pops up and says, we're ready to apply, and where's our allocation? There's no allocation for us. But there's always those released funds from agencies who didn't apply. So then we take some of those released funds. When we run the allocations the second time for the final Perkins allocation, then we would include that new charter school or that new agency in the final calculation. So then they would get an allocation that year.
Okay. Okay, and then if 85% of the Perkins funds has to go to local agencies, then if we want to incentivize them to utilize some of those funds and pool them together in, let's say, a regional consortia or whatever, which is really kind of the feedback we've gotten is that we need to support more of these regional consortia organizations and be able to kind of manage and more effectively and efficiently use funds all around. We could still do that in our application process, right?
Correct. And Perkins 5 now has a little bit more flexibility on allowing agencies, even across levels, so secondary to post-secondary, for instance, to pool a portion of their funds to do those collaborative efforts. So it's a little bit, I think Perkins 5 is a little bit freer on the ability for local agencies or even to set up regional collaboratives, whereas the old one, they kind of didn't really prohibit it, but the language wasn't as clear as it is in Perkins 5.
Okay, great.
Member Rucker.
So then, as it relates to adult ed programs that are likely to be funded by these programs, most of the adult ed programs that are part of high schools are now part of a consortium or with community college districts. Is there a difference in how they need to do the work to submit the application that's going to be changed because of the requirements in Perkins 5? And is that something that we need to be thinking about in addressing, maybe not in the transition plan, but in the full state plan?
Yeah, as I look at that Perkins 5 and I look at particularly the requirement in post-secondary education where when we run your allocations, if you're a post-secondary institution and your allocation is less than $50,000, in order to get those funds, you have to form a consortium to do that. There are states that, with their Perkins funds, that do not fund individual agencies. They only fund consortiums. That's the way they work. I think Minnesota is one of those that does it that way. But in light of how our new adult ed funds are distributed through consortia, what we might want to consider in our final state plan is funding adult schools through those consortias in some way, because if they were an individual adult agency, maybe they could get their own money. But if they have to form a consortium, maybe that money has to flow through the existing consortium. Because here's what happens with Perkins. Year after year, we get different consortias are formatted only to get the money. They don't necessarily collaborate or work together. They only form those consortia as a way to apply for the money. Once they get the money, they divvy it up among themselves, and they identify a fiscal agent, but that fiscal agent, and not rightly so, but they shouldn't do this, but they redistribute the funds among that consortium members and do their own things. They don't necessarily work together. So that's been a problem, I think, in adult ed. And I think, in fact, for some small community colleges, there was a time years ago when we had an adult agency in the Bay Area, an adult agency in Southern California that were in the same consortia. Now, tell me how they did anything in a collaborative effort.
So I want to.
But we had put a stop to that and didn't allow that. Their consortia have to make some kind of reasonable sense, right? But now that we have these adult consortias established, it would almost make sense to me to really look at that and say, is that a better use of the money? Because they're already set up this collaborative effort. And instead of having them set up different collaboratives to get the money, let's say, no, if you're going to apply as a collaborative, it needs to go through your existing
Consortia. Yeah. So I'm already sitting here. I've looked at my colleague, member Costa, about this very idea. I think that we probably should stick a pin in that part of the conversation for the state plan and talk about the use of the existing adult ed consortias for the purpose of doing this funding scheme, and make it clear and give guidance to them on how that's going to work, and even try to explain that. I don't think it's necessary to put that in the transition plan, but as you do the work to build out this whole process in this section for the state plan, making it clear and giving guidance out to the existing adult ed consortia, this is the consortia you will use for this purpose and for the application of these funds.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Amy and I will probably be holding hands on that one and talking in some detail.
So I'm thinking as we work with our stakeholders to develop that final state plan, and working with those adult representatives to that group, we can certainly express our concern with how that's done, and that we don't want these. I hate to see collaborations form just to get money. I'd rather see collaborations form to do work.
Well, there should be some statement that says, we expect, and this is how you will be accountable for the work you choose to do as a consortia, that to make it plain that you probably should work with the existing structure you've got. Yeah.
And I'm sure working with those stakeholders, we can develop a really good plan to do that.
So can I bring up, we get at the state board waivers of Perkins for rurals who don't. So yeah, maybe you can elaborate a little bit, because that's the opposite. It seems like it's the opposite.
Well, currently, and I can answer that question because I work with staff on the waivers. Currently, the conversation on waivers in this area is guided by what is in our plan under Perkins 4. So, and we're going to continue doing that until we actually do have an approved state plan. So that's a conversation. Once the state plan is approved, we probably are going to have to send out some type of information memo, some type of additional guidance about any changes that may affect the waiver process as it relates to those consortia, any of those things.
So that waiver provision for the minimum allocation amount really only applies to secondary agencies. And what it says is you have to be in a rural, sparsely populated area, and you have to provide evidence that you're unable to form a consortia. And you have to meet both of those criteria. Then if you meet both of those criteria, you can apply to the state for a waiver. And what the feds say is that the state board has to identify criteria and measure all applicants for those waivers under that same criteria. There is no provision for adult funds for a waiver. So on the adult side, you have to have a minimum allocation of $50,000 to get funding. And if you don't meet that minimum requirement, you have to form a consortia to get the money. If you're unable to form a consortia, you can't apply for the money. There's no provision for a waiver for a rural or any other reason on the post-secondary side, only on the secondary.
Ortiz-Lacon.
Thank you. That's really good information. And this is the first time that I go through a reauthorization process for Perkins. It would be great if we could also put a pin on lessons learned, what didn't work. I know one of the things was, here's your money, CDE, here's our money, and we're just walking away. And I know that one improvement is that we're actually collaborating. But what else? What were some of the other points of contention that we could start trying to get ahead of? What were some of the complaints that we heard from stakeholders? I'm not sure that the previous plans required stakeholder engagement, but I'm sure we did some.
Absolutely.
what were some of the complaints? What did people feel this was great, that was added, this should have been added? Those things would be great as we're considering this new process so that we could keep that in mind. Thank you.
We've had a lot of changes in the state with LCFF and CTIG and all these efforts that we've done towards collaboration and so forth. That's really, the whole atmosphere has really changed. So certainly those discussions need to take place.
Suggestion, thanks. Okay, so I'm going to redirect our attention back to the top of page 26, question 6, about a potential waiver for the secondary allocation formula, in which we stated we would not be seeking waiver for that one. Any comments on that? Okay, then for question 7, the waiver to post-secondary allocation formula, for which we do have a response.
So, top of 27, maybe change bulk to promise grant, huh? We've changed that name already. The middle 2019-20 section 132 allocations will be based on unduplicated count of students or adults enrolled in CT. Do we need to define what unduplicated is, or that's a given that everybody knows? And particularly those at the Fed.
The statutory definitions and the student funding formula, I think they actually use it in LCFF too. Just means you can't count somebody twice.
Whether that's a known thing at the federal level, I assume so, but.
Yeah.
I think they actually use that language in the act as well.
Okay.
That question about the waiver, that's what I had explained earlier, where Perkins requires the adult ed funds or the post-secondary funds be distributed by Pell Grant recipients. And we had determined years ago that that would not provide an equitable distribution. And so we used economically disadvantaged students. And we do collect data from community colleges and our adult school programs and our OCPs that serve adults, and gather that and calculate a per student amount, and then distribute the funds that way.
Member Costa.
I don't know that the feds will let us do this, but I do just want to say in higher ed, what we talk about a lot and what our Cal Grant proposal from the system this year is based on is total need. And total need is actually different than eligibility for economic public assistance or student aid. Pat's saying they won't let us do it, but just meaning that the need that a student has is beyond what we offer in student aid, because it includes things like their housing costs, their transportation cost, and you know, so it's much broader than what we have here. But if the feds won't let us do it, I defer to Patricia.
So this bulleted list that you see here about the Promise Grant, Pell Grant, those are all things that we have identified in the past that would be indicators of economically disadvantagement. So if there's other indicators that we might want to include, then my suggestion would be the next time we submit the waiver to the feds that we include those other items in our list. But they would have to be clear indicators of economically disadvantagement.
Any other thoughts on this one? Okay, so moving to the middle of page 28, question 8, about reserving funds. Question 9 at the top of page 29.
I'm just wondering if we have more updated financials. This seems really old.
It does. This is the latest information I got from division staff, actually, this chart.
So is that a maybe?
Well, we'd have to check with division staff and see if they have more current information, but this is the latest information I have.
Okay.
And remember, this is based on maintenance of effort, so it's going to be a year, at least a year behind, because we're looking at past expenditures and so forth. This is a lot less than that $1,538 billion that was in the last iteration of this plan, or whatever that number was. But it's important to know that we should not be counting for maintenance of effort any short-term monies. And fortunately for us, Perkins 5's changed, and this is, to me, a significant change from Perkins 4 to 5. And that is, under Perkins 4, the old act, if you did not maintain your effort, the federal government had the right to take away all of your money, not just a portion of your money. It was all of your money. So maintenance of effort was a critical issue under prior Perkins Acts. Under Perkins 5, they've changed that, and they say that whatever you do not maintain your effort, whatever percentage that you do not maintain your effort, the federal government can take away an equal percentage of your grant.
Yikes.
So in other words, if our maintenance of effort goes down by 10%, under Perkins 4, we would have lost the whole grant. Under Perkins 5, if we don't make it, if our maintenance of effort is reduced by 10%, we would only lose 10% of our Perkins allocation. That's significant when you look at Perkins 4 versus Perkins 5. But it's still important that the state maintains its current efforts in CTE funding, and that we don't use short-term limited funds, like, for instance, Career Pathways Trust money. We would not want to include that as part of our maintenance of effort because it no longer exists. And then how would we make up those funds? So we get real careful with the funds that we depict in this chart as far as maintenance of effort. One concern I had was the difference between fiscal year 15-16 under community colleges to 16-17 under community colleges, and having not, I don't know those numbers, but I would want to ensure that that increase was certainly ongoing funds and not, and we did not include limited term funds in that number because it went up significantly from those years.
The strong workforce money of $200 million is ongoing.
Yeah, as long as it's ongoing, we're good.
Member Rucker.
Okay, so my question is related to what's reported for the secondary programs. I know that beginning this year, there was another data field that was added to the school report cards that collects per pupil expenditure information that will be reported next year on the report cards for the secondary programs. How differently will that information that's be collected be able to be reflected in this for the secondary CDE and RLCPs?
Well, I think,
and I know it's okay to say I don't know because you don't know what the data is actually going to look like.
Yeah, I really don't know.
But knowing that that data category has now been added to the report cards that are going to show up both for the sites as well as for the LEAs, including the county offices, that's going to look different and will be more, and I'm going to use this word on purpose, contemporaneous than what you may actually be collecting for the community college districts, because it now has to be reported annually for the LEAs on their school accountability report card.
So in this section for maintenance effort, we're only looking at funds expended for career technical education students.
Mm-hmm.
And when we do a disaggregated fiscal effort by student, we're only include those students who are enrolled in career technical education.
Yeah, so the report card is going to show it by funding category. So you will be able to actually identify.
That may be helpful actually for us, yeah, and give us a more accurate number. The other thing I point out in this section, only because members may not know, is that when we have to define our maintenance of effort to the federal government, we can send it in one of two ways. We can send it as an aggregated amount, and if we don't make our maintenance of effort in the aggregated amount, then we can turn around and send it to them in the disaggregated per student maintenance of effort. And in past years, we've had to actually use that because in past years, while the money has decreased, sometimes you get a opposite increase or decrease in student population. So while you may not make it in the aggregated amount, oftentimes we do make it in the per student amount. It just depends on enrollments versus funding, that kind of issue.
Okay. So we're basically done. Member Costa.
It's going to shock everyone to know that I do want to talk about the budget Form B. Patricia's with me. And a lot of them are just really questions to make sure that I understand. But one, we have in line number 1, and I'm on page 35, we have the total Perkins 5 allocation, and you have a number in there. And I'm just wondering, how did we derive that amount? Have the feds given us this number? Is it based on our past allocations? How did we kind of arrive at this number?
So the $120 million that you see at the top is actually our state's allocation of Perkins funds. So that's what the feds give us.
Told us.
And then the second column, or the second row down, state administration, we simply take 5% of those funds, and that's how we obtain that number. Then the next number, leadership funds, that's 10% of the money. And then this is kind of maybe the confusing part that happens under that. So we have state individuals in state institutions. And that counts, that's correctional institutions, both for adults and youth. It's also California School for the Blind and California School for the Deaf, both. They receive a portion of those funds from that category. What Perkins 4 allowed you to do is you could use up to 1% of the funds for state institutions. I think under Perkins 5, it's now increased to up to 2% for state institutions. Where we've decreased that amount to state institutions only because they had a situation over many, many years of releasing funds back to us, and they would not fully expend their funds. So we've kind of determined that the amount of money that's shown there is about what they can use and spend for career technical education. But it does not mean that we could not give them more. We could. Perkins 5 now allows you to give them up to 2%. But the 2% is based on the 10%. It's 2% of that 10%, the state leadership funds. It's not 2% of the total funds.
Well, previewing for our next real estate plan, I'm going to want to see us maximize that, and I'm going to want to see the difference actually go to those that are incarcerated. And I think that part of that is the policy landscape in California has completely changed, in which we have many more individuals being released from correctional facilities back into our communities. And the research is very clear that the number one way to make sure that they're successful upon reentry is education. And the Chancellor's Office just released a report on some of our outcomes in correctional settings, and we've developed some best practices. And we do have a lot of work to do, but we have some great partnerships that have formed between some of our correctional settings and our community colleges. And I'd really like to see in the full-blown plan that we increase this number to account for those individuals.
And then I do see a mistake down here that I'll have to fix, but I've already noted it. So then there's two categories down the bottom, row 5 and row 6. One says non-traditional training and employment. The other one is special populations recruitment. So non-traditional training and employment, what the Act says is the state is allowed to use not more than 1% or $150,000, whichever is less, for to serve for non-traditional training and employment. So that $150,000 down there should be in that line. And that is the amount of money that we send to the Joint Special Populations Advisory Committee. That's where they get their 150 from. But that's the most that the federal law allows us to spend, because it says the lesser of the two. It doesn't say, if we calculated it by 1%, it would be higher, but then it says 1% or 150,000, whichever is less. So we give the full max there, 150. And then under special populations of recruitment, this is actually a new category that's included in Perkins 5 that really wasn't specifically spelled out before. And what it says is that you're allowed to use, I think it's 1% again, but the minimum is 50,000. And again, it's the lesser of the two. So that category under Perkins 5 would be a maximum of 50,000 that we would spend for special populations recruitment. I don't know, I haven't not heard any discussion of where that money would go or who it would go to, but it's, when you're talking about special populations recruitment in California, it's not a lot of money. But a discussion could be around providing those extra funds to the JSPAC and kind of give them the directive that one of the things they need to do is a lot more in the recruitment area, and we're providing these additional funds to them to do that. That'd be one suggestion. There's, you know, other ways that we could approach that. But both of those categories would not have to be utilized during the transition plan, but certainly during the full plan, we would have to provide in our budget monies in both of those categories. But again, those monies come as a percentage of that 10% for leadership funds. They're not part of the total. If you added all these percentages, you'd be well over 100% because of that, right? So it's part of that. So then what happens is then 85% of the money is distributed locally, like I stated earlier.
Member Costa.
The admin, because this is a weird governance structure where CDE is the lead applicant to the feds. You guys have an agreement with the chancellor's office. So how does the admin work? And I understand the 5% as a cap, but is that going to CDE? Just how does it work?
Well, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head the percentages. If you gave me a minute, I could look them up because I do have them.
Okay, while we're waiting for that, Patricia DeCosta, did you have something to say?
If you don't mind, to indulge me, I have a question because of what Russ was explaining in terms of, you know, the limitations that we have for some of these categories. I was thinking more specifically in the non-traditional training and employment area, because it was expressed interest earlier that perhaps we could get more money into some of these areas. Is there a way for us to request a waiver? Because, I mean, California is a huge state, so 150,000 compared to maybe, I don't know, Connecticut or some other small state is peanuts. So is there a way for us to push back on them in terms of these requirements?
There's actually no provision in the act that clearly states that there's the opportunity for a waiver, but I think you could probably make that argument with them and just see what they said and say we would like to spend more. But I think it's important to note that if we did choose to spend more, it has to come out of that 10% leadership funds. It can't come out of the 85% that goes to local recipients. So it'd have to come out of that. Yeah, you can always ask. So then to get to the question about how funds are distributed, so years ago, interestingly enough, CD used to get all of the admin funds. But then under Perkins, I think it's Perkins 3, we made an interagency agreement with the Chancellor's office. Even though they got some Perkins money prior to Perkins 3, they did not get any admin funds. So at that time, we made an agreement with the community colleges that we would split the funds in this manner. So the 5% for state leadership, since CDE was the agency who's responsible for submitting the application and all of those kind of things, they would get out of that 5%, they would get 64% of those funds. And Chancellor's office would get 36%. So it was basically almost a 60-40 split, not quite, it was 64-36 for state administration. They also determined that at that time to split the leadership funds, and the leadership funds were closer to a 50-50 split. The actual number was 51% of the funds, leadership funds, or that 10%. And this is after pulling out the special populations funds and the state institution funds. Then 51% of the state leadership funds would be held at CDE or distributed through CDE, and 49% through the community college chancellor's office. And then the 85% of the money is distributed on a very complicated and time-consuming formula. It's actually labor-intensive to calculate that out, but it's really based on CT enrollments in prior year, and that fluctuates every year a little bit. So within that split of 85% of the funds, we have a provision in there for what we call a 3% hold harmless. So if one year the K-12 population soars and it looks like we're going to get a bigger share of those local funds, then we would be only limited to 3% because we don't want to hurt the other agency. And that's a reciprocal back and forth. So if the community college's numbers go through the roof, then CDE would not be hurt because we'd institute that 3% hold harmless. And that has been implemented a couple of times, but usually the numbers stay fairly consistent and we don't have to do that. But there have been a couple of years when we've had to use the hold harmless, that 3% hold harmless. So basically that's how it comes out. When you come down to the final numbers on the local assistance funds, that 85% of the money, even though CDE gets the lion's share of the admin and the leadership funds are almost split 50-50, the lion's share of the local assistance money goes to the post-secondary education. And actually, post-secondary education gets a lot more than secondary. It's just the way it works out.
Member Costa.
Just really quick, so using previous enrollment, is that a federal requirement or has that just been our practice?
That's been our practice because there are states that just come to agreement on how they're going to split the funds, and some say if they're the sole agency responsible for administering the funds, they get the full admin, and then I don't know how they do the leadership, but then they split the other funds, the local assistance funds. They're all over the place. I have a chart that shows every state and how they split out their funds. Most of them split them at some just arbitrary percentage. Say we're going to split the funds 50-50 or 60-40 or 75-25. They just pick a percentage and say that's what we're doing.
Member Fan.
Thanks for that breakdown. I appreciate that. So the recruitment of the special populations and the non-traditional training and employment, that's done at the state level, the leadership level, right? That part of the 15%.
Right.
So I wonder, though, when the 85% is doled out to the regions, to local agencies, can we encourage them to do recruitment of special populations? Can we encourage them to do training and employment of non-traditional jobs or whatever it may be? Can we encourage that or not?
Well, I think you can. The feds always allow states to put more stringent requirements on this money than they have. You just can't do the opposite, but you can certainly put more stringent requirements. I would say you can certainly encourage them to do that. That's not a problem. We did have a problem a few years ago when some local audience were using, we felt, of their Perkins funds, particularly administrative salaries. So when our state Perkins 4 was written, we put a provision in there that says you cannot use more than 5% of your funds to administer your local funds. And that basically, we chose that because that's a requirement the feds put on us as a state agency. And we just push that requirement down to the local level and say, so that you don't get carried away and funding a lot of admin activities with your Perkins money instead of giving the money to the kids, then we felt it was important to kind of pass down that requirement, and we did in the last state plan. So you could think about that for Perkins 5 and writing that state plan of putting those kind of provisions in there.
I would, when we get to that point, kind of tread along that line in that if there are special populations that we really want to serve and recruit, then, and we're capped at the state level, a strong direction or encouragement to the local agencies may be a path I'd like for us to consider.
Right.
Thank you.
A lot of heads nodding on that idea. Other final thoughts on this draft transition plan? Yeah. Thanks to.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks to staff, thanks to the committee members. I think next step is to figure out when our April date is, but to your point, Member Ortiz-Lacon, it feels like there's a lot less to do between this version and next version, so I'm assuming staff will be able to get you that much more in advance, not to speak for them, but.
And I just might add, if you have any specific verbiage that you think is missing from there that you think I should add, send that to me and I'll put that in there. But also, I just want to take the time to really thank Jeff and his people at community colleges and also Patricia for their input into this, because while I did a lot of the typing, it was input from many people that made this happen in a relatively short period of time. So thank you. Yeah, you're welcome.
Oh, my pleasure. Member Rucker?
I just also wanted to add my commendations to the staff from the community college office, from the Department of Ed, and our own Patricia. It's always heartening to me to know that the work I'm asked to do on behalf of the schools and for the responsibility I've taken on in sitting at this dais, that I'm supported by the depth of content expertise and the commitment to the collaboration that this draft document clearly shows. You really and truly need to be well commended and highly appreciated for the effort that you did in such a very, very short period of time to turn this around. I have great confidence going forward, not only in what this draft is going to say, but how well it represents the kind of work that is being done in California. So I really and truly want to commend you for that.
I echo those eloquent words.
And thank you, members, for the insightful feedback and comments as usual. So that was agenda item 2.
All right.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I'll turn it back to you, Chair Grande.
Thank you very much, Heather. I appreciate that. We have an opportunity either to go to a break or to finish out, the end of our agenda. So before we get to the most pressing item, which is our April meeting date, let's see if there's any comments from members of the public. So I want to thank the members of the public that have attended our meeting today and see if there are any public comments that need to be made. If you'll step forward to the microphone, you may want to keep your comments brief. We limit speakers to 2 minutes apiece, and we ask that you state your name both first and last for the record before speaking. Why, I think I recognize Patricia DeCoste.
Yes. Okay, I'm here on behalf of Cheryl Ryder. She had to leave, but she was sitting here in the audience. So she wrote out her public comment, so I'm just going to read it. Executive Director, Career Development, Placer County Office of Education. So regarding the addition of a definition of pathway to the guiding policy principles document, she has 3 bullets. CTE leaders in the field may look to a definition as a mandate. Bullet number 2, during the fall of 2017, Carolyn Zachary, then Perkins Unit Manager, convened community college representatives, leaders from the Workforce Development Board, ADELDED administrators, and CTE leaders from the field to define career pathways. Bullet number 3, although the definition was not formalized, it may be informative as the committee considers adding a definition to the guiding document. And then she has another comment regarding the equity and access to dual enrollment and early college options. 3 bullets. Members of the committee recognize that not all students have access to dual enrollment. Bullet number 2, some factors that limit student access include resistance by college faculty, and some colleges will not accept agreements from K-12 schools outside their attendance area. Bullet number 3, is it possible to utilize the new online community college? There you go.
Any other comments from members of the public? How about any further comments from any of our advisory committee members up here? Ready to take a look at calendars for an April meeting date? All right, so there have been multiple conflicts. We've tried, so let's see if we can't lock down our April meeting dates.
Was April 22nd suggested?
Yes.
Does that date not work for everyone? It's spring break. I'll be out. Oh, okay. My spring break is the 15th to the 19th.
It doesn't have to work for all of us, but
We'll need to have two and two, at least for a quorum.
So is there any way that 4 of us could be here on the 22nd? The original scheduled date?
I can.
1, 2, I'll be here. That makes 3.
Yeah, I can, but up until about noon-ish.
So if we did it in the morning.
In the morning, it would work better for me.
I have class in the morning.
If Amy and I are here, that makes 2 from the Board of Governors. And if Patricia and Ting could be here, that makes... What? What? Gasp?
And I'll be here at 10. I'll come here after my class at 10.
So could we schedule it for Monday, April 22nd? Could we do 8 to noon before Ting would have to leave, or can it be, can it?
Have the room.
What? Oh, that was so easy. Oh, fantastic. Then I think Monday, April 22nd from 8 to noon will be our next meeting. Everyone want to put that on their calendar, and then I will thank everyone in attendance for our very productive meeting this afternoon and morning. And we are now going to be adjourned. It is, let's see, it is, what? Yes, May 29th. Wednesday, May 29th. Okay.
Folks for a time.
Oh, we need time on our Wednesday, May 29th meeting. Oh, good.
That's after
Memorial Day.
session, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so should be good.
Should we try a 9 to 1, a 10 to 2, 9? 9 to 1 on May 29th as well. We've got both of these locked down. We have been super productive today.
You said May 29th.
Yeah,
This is Wednesday.
Wednesday, May 29th. And we'll go for,
Don't be this efficient, because I might get excited and think we can do this all the time.
Wednesday, May 29th, I'm sorry, what time?
9 to 1, is that okay? So are we good? Everyone's got their calendar items? Yes.
Could we push you for July just to see if there are any, I don't know if there, we did not have anything any date even proposed out. We don't have July, September, or November. July 12th
Yes.
was original. Will that work for everybody? Because
Yes.
we will no longer be, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. So Friday, July 12th, were we going to say,
It had originally 10 to 3. Should we go with 10 to 3?
okay?
Yeah. Okay.
10 to
And you can do the 29th in May, right? I will come late.
Yeah.
Can we push our luck for September?
Okay, there's a question about doing July 12th from 9 to 1.
Only because it's following the state board meeting, and then you want to go camping the next day for like 4 days or 5 days.
Oh, sure.
9
So 9 to 1?
9 to 1 or 2?
9 to 2? Okay.
You're looking forward to going camping. So then, yes, we will bend over backwards to make that happen. Okay, but notice how far away from you I'm sitting.
Can we push it for September? While we're at it? I'm ready to, I'm ready to do the whole year.
We don't need to, we're done. We don't need to keep working until September.
What do we have for September?
I mean, we had originally proposed the 13th of September. I think that was an original date. Looks good? That would be the day after our board meeting, our
Yeah.
State Board of Education board meeting.
And are we good with 10 to 3 on that day?
9 to 2.
Okay.
Yeah, you could have a new class.
Yeah.
So you're talking September 13th?
Yes.
I'm good.
I mean, most of us are good.
Oh, what about you?
We'll hold the date. We'll hold the 13th.
Right.
And then, do we want to try to do November since we have to submit our recommendations to finance and the appropriate committees, fiscal and policy committees for our outcomes for the CTIG and the strong workforce?
So one issue that we're coming up with is Dr. Fawn doesn't know his schedule for the fall yet, and it could be problematic on Fridays with limited availability with member Costa. So I'm hesitant to go further than September at this
Okay.
time.
All right.
Yeah, we can revisit that like in the July meeting or something like that if need be.
So right now, it looks like our next meeting is going to be April 22nd. 22nd? Want to make sure that I have this right.
Oh, is what
8 to 12, or should it be 8 to 1? Because you had mentioned a 5-hour block. So,
Is the item, the plan and approval of that plan? That's the only item we have?
Well, and we also have the guiding principles that we'll be bringing back. The guiding principles.
But if we have to move principals to May, I don't see why we can't do that and dedicate all of April to the transition.
okay.
Okay.
And that's up to the board if we want to push.
Yeah, I'm hoping we don't have to do much more on the principles. So let's try to bring it so that we all move forward, knowing this is what we're going with.
I think we can complete both of that in the April meeting and we don't have to meet in May.
We have a state plan to get going on.
All right. So then our next meeting will be Monday, April 22nd, and we are going for an 8 to noon. We're being very, very efficient that day, 8 to noon. And anything else for the good of the group, or shall we adjourn for today? I will entertain a motion to adjourn. Fantastic.
Second.
Is there a second? All right. We are now adjourned, and it is 3:19 p.m. Thank you all.
Right.
So